Bueno, buenas tardes, buenos días, perdón. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas, bienvenides. Este es el primer simposio de Educación y Comportamiento Humano. Muchas gracias a todos y a todas y a todos por estar acá acompañándonos en este día tan importante para el área de educación de la Universidad Torcuato Di Tella. Hoy es nuestro primer simposio. Quisiera presentarme. Mi nombre es Cecilia Calero y soy la directora del área de educación. Y quiero empezar este simposio agradeciendo muy particularmente a la International Brain Research Organization, que este año me otorgó la Ibro Diversity Grant, y que junto a la colaboración del CEPE Di Tella, y en particular quiero mencionar a Ornella Iacono, hicieron posible que hoy estemos acá organizando este simposio, el cual preparamos junto también a Ileana Minutela y a Julieta Goldstein, y que va a contar con la participación de investigadores e investigadoras nacionales e internacionales del mejor nivel. Este simposio lo pensamos de alguna manera para interpelarnos, para tener una importante, una necesaria, y creo que hasta incluso muchas veces incómoda discusión, pero que es tan importante, sobre género y perspectiva de género en el contexto de las ciencias del comportamiento. La propuesta para hoy es comenzar y abrir de alguna manera un espacio de discusión que ponga de manifiesto la importancia que tiene estudiar y comprender también al género con una perspectiva que incluya las ciencias del comportamiento. Y también la idea que busca este simposio es resaltar de manera significativa la necesidad que tenemos de establecer y de financiar programas y centros de investigación focalizados en estos temas, para que podamos realmente enriquecer y mejorar nuestras políticas educativas con la evidencia necesaria. Y de alguna manera, ¿por qué pensamos esta propuesta? Bueno, porque estos temas nos atraviesan no solamente como educadores y educadoras, sino también como personas, y necesitamos entonces poner en agenda estas discusiones para poder construir espacios que sean más inclusivos, más equitativos, y que nos permitan desarrollarnos como individuos plenos. Así que bueno, muchísimas gracias por estar ahí del otro lado y por participar de este simposio. Antes de comenzar, quisiera pasarles dos datos importantes. Uno es que si miran en sus Zooms, abajo hay un botoncito que dice chat o chatear. Ahí pueden dejarnos sus preguntas, sus consultas, sus comentarios a lo largo de todo el día, y nosotros vamos a interpelar y después a hablar con los y las charlistas. Y otra cosa que es muy importante es que tenemos una traducción simultánea bueno, en este momento los que están escuchando en el canal en inglés estarán escuchando a Marina, y después cuando comencemos y hagamos el cambio al inglés, cuando empecemos la primera charla, pueden pasarse a escuchar el canal en español, aquellos que no hablen o que no comprendan el idioma inglés, ¿sí? Así que la traducción simultánea está abajo en un botón que dice Interpretation o interpretación. Cliquean ahí, eligen el audio en el que quieren escuchar, ya sea español o sea inglés. Bueno, sin dar más vueltas, voy a hacer el switch. So now I'm going to start speaking in English to welcome Georgina Rippon. Gina Rippon. Hi, Gina, if you are there. Hi. Oh, hello.
Hello.
Thank you.
Here.
Thank you very much for being here with us today. As I said in Twitter, es un lujo, it's a luxury to have you here with us to open the symposium. And for those who don't know her, Professor Georgina Rippon is an emeritus professor of cognitive neuroimaging at the Aston Brain Center, Aston University in Birmingham. And her research is truly amazing and involves state-of-the-art brain imaging techniques to investigate development disorders such as dyslexia and autism. She also investigates the use of neuroscience techniques to explore the social brain, including threats to self-esteem and effects on gender stereotypes. She's an outspoken critic of neurotrash, the populist misuse of neuroscience research to misinterpret our understanding of the world, of the brain, and most particularly to prop up outdated stereotypes. So As you can see, she has an amazing CD, and she also writes very, very good books. Just to mention some, the Gender and Brain. There's also Gender and Our Brains. She's such an important person for this topic, and for us, it's a true pressure to have her here. So today she will be presenting her talk entitled "Sex, Science, and the Brain: Where Have All the Young Girls Gone?" So thank you again very much, Sheena, for being here. And the Zoom is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed, Cecilia, for that very flattering introduction. And thank you very much to you and all your supporters and your sponsors for the invitation. And my only regret is that I am not actually there. I am still sitting at home, as I have been for the last 18 months. But it's great to have an opportunity to talk to a different audience, to an audience who may bring a different perspective to this issue. So I will hopefully now start my presentation. Hopefully you'll see that. Yes.
Perfect.
Is that
yes,
all right,
perfect.
Cecilia? You can see that. Good. Okay. Okay. So it's entitled "Sex, Science, and the Brain." So packing in quite a lot in the next 45 minutes. Where have all the young girls gone? And that issue is really because in discussing with Cecilia what she would like the audience to get out of what I might have to say, and the message that I'd like to convey to the audience. Talking about the underrepresentation of women in science, which is something that we'll get into, seemed like a good case study, if you like, to explore the issues in this area. As Cecilia mentioned, I'm a brain imager, so I'm lucky enough to have access to high-level brain imaging techniques. My principal area of research is into developmental disorders such as autism. So I'm really interested in how brains get to be different, any type of brains and any type of differences. And I got drawn into the area of sex differences in the brain, and we'll come back to that as a specific topic, really because it was this is an area where it has for centuries been assumed here is an inbuilt difference that we can study. This can tell us about how the brain works, where differences come from, and we can use our brain imaging techniques to prove the theories we have that such brain differences exist. And so those are all things that you will see I am about to challenge in the next 45 minutes. Okay, so the key thing we need to remember is that there's two big issues which I just want briefly you to remember. I've called them the big questions: sex differences in the brain. At the moment, I'm talking about sex, not gender, and I think this is quite important. And an issue we have here is, what do we mean by different? And that's a really important principle to bear in mind, because in everyday conversation, when we talk about different, we probably mean distinct. We mean this person is different from that person, this experience is different from that experience. When we're talking about sex differences in the brain, you know, whatever our particular theoretical approach, everybody acknowledges that actually we're talking about very tiny differences, both in the brain and in behavior. And that's something which is important to remember, because this is an area of research which, as we all have brains, and as we all have a gender of some kind, means that everybody's very interested. So it's a really hot topic for the public communication of science. So there's lots of people interested in this kind of research, but it's being translated perhaps by enthusiastic journalists who are not neuroscientists by training, or maybe not even scientists by training, are being moved on into teacher training arenas, business organization, diversity and inclusion arenas, etc. So it's an area where there's some really high-level research being done, but it becomes very interesting to lots and lots of people who have varying levels of expertise. And so there are some key issues that we need to acknowledge, and that is these differences we're talking about are tiny. These are the kind of differences, if you were measuring the height between males and females, you'd get a distribution of height measures for a male population like this and for a female population like this. Clearly, there is a difference between them, pretty large, so that if you wanted somebody tall, asking if they were male or female will give you a reliable answer, but there's still a bit of an overlap. So there are some women who are taller than some men that people would accept. But when we're talking about aspects of brain structures and functions, and also behavior, as we'll see a bit later, these areas of overlap are much closer. So if you look at a distribution of data in males and females, big overlap. So actually very, very difficult on the individual level to tell people apart. Knowing somebody is male or female is actually not going to tell you much about brain structures or personality or behavior characteristics. So that's important to bear in mind. The other issue is, why are we actually asking them? You know, what are these questions and why are we asking them? This is not just a question of anatomy. We're not just interested in whether there are anatomical differences between male and female brains. They mean something to us. If we talk about the female brain and the male brain, that probably conveys a lot of stereotypical information to the people who are listening to us. We assume there is such a thing as a female brain, and having a female brain means a particular range of downstream consequences. We want to know where they come from. Is it nature? Is this something that's inbuilt? Is this a kind of essential predetermined characteristic of half of the population as opposed to the other half? Or is it something where everything that's going on in the outside world, you know, we're born into the world as a blank slate, and any differences which emerge are due to the outside world? So a nature or nurture argument, and part of my thesis that I'm talking about, is that that's actually past its sell-by date. What we now know about the brain and its reaction to the outside world is that we can't ask questions about nature or nurture. It's hugely entangled. What do such differences mean for the brain's owners? As I said, this is not just an anatomical question. What does it mean if you've got a thicker cortex or a bigger amygdala, or the bridge of fibers between the two halves of your brain is stronger? We want to know if this means we behave differently, we have different skills, we have different abilities. And this is where you get the sort of stereotypical binary divides, that you're either good at empathizing or you're good at systemizing. The classic popular trope that the men are from Mars and women are from Venus, the idea is, you know, we're so different because of our different brains, we could almost be from different planets. And that we have different skills, and this is where we, for example, the map reading male characteristic or multitasking female characteristic. But possibly what I'm really going to focus on mainly, particularly as you have Lise Eliot coming on later, who may well be asking some of these questions as well, or answering some of those questions as well, is why are we asking this question? And that is because if we look in the world today, the world is full of gender gaps. There are all sorts of imbalances in the world in terms of political representation, etc. We want to know where those come from. As a brain scientist, interested in the social implications of our work, we need to say, you know, can we marry these two up together? Do we think these gender gaps are inevitable because of some kind of inbuilt biology, or are they gender gaps which are something that we could actually deal with? So mostly today I'll be talking about the gender gap question. And just to remind you about gender gaps, I won't go into this in detail, but however much progress we like to think we've made in the world since, say, the 18th century, when the interest in differences between the brains of men and the brains of women first emerged, and then scientists looked at the society and said, well, definitely there are differences. You know, women are clearly inferior to males, and we can only look at society to show that's wrong. Well, clearly, hopefully, the political agenda has moved on. And yet, the World Economic Forum every year produces a global gender gap report, looks at the global gender gap or gender gap differences in over 150 different countries across the world, to do with political representation, financial independence, health outcomes, access to education between males and females in each of these countries. And they bring this report out every year. The 2021 has just come out. And what they actually demonstrate is that nowhere in the world is there gender equality. There are countries in the world, and the top four here, Iceland, Finland, Norway, New Zealand, the gender gap's the smallest in terms of these measures, and that's important to bear in mind. But nowhere in the world has the gender gap being closed. And they also do a kind of overall picture of how the gender gaps are changing in different countries, and generate a kind of average metric to say, looking at the rate of change in the world, how long will it take before we see no gender gaps in the world? Sadly, with the 2021 report, in 2020, they said the time it will take to close the worldwide gender gap was 99.5 years. So a long way to go in spite of all sorts of great initiatives, etc. This year, quite likely related to the pandemic and the gender gaps in the impact of the pandemic, that gender gap rate of change has increased, the rate of change has decreased. So we're now looking at the possibility it will take over 130 years for the world to see, no longer to see gender gaps. Now, obviously, in terms of a kind of statement like that, there's huge numbers of political and social and financial aspects we need to bear in mind. But it's something that we need to think about. Where are these gender gaps coming from? How might we deal with them? Are the ways in which we are dealing with them realistic? Are they actually addressing the issues that need addressing? And that's what we're thinking about. So I'm going to show you this now very quickly, really because I want to show you it, and then I want you to forget it. Because actually, as we'll see, and as I'm sure Lise Eliot will show you later, this is a chain of argument which has actually informed a lot of neuroscience research for the last 150 to 100 years, but has then also gone on to inform people's beliefs about themselves, about how they should educate their children, about how they should deal with their employees. And this chain of argument is that whatever it is, bearing in mind that we didn't have access to genetic information when this chain of argument was actually established, whatever it is which determines the anatomical differences between males and females, because you could actually see those, also determined the fact that they had different brains. Now, bear in mind, and we'll come back to this, that these theories were generated before we had access to intact living human brains in intact living humans. The kind of work that I do using brain imaging techniques, we knew what brains might look like when they were dead. We knew the consequences of certain types of disease or damage, but we didn't really know what the brain was like. But that didn't stop early scientists from generating hypotheses. So there was definitely something, a female brain, definitely the male brain. Next stage in the argument, if you had this sort of brain, it meant you had these sort of personality, psychological characteristics, these particular kind of cognitive skills. If you had a lady brain, then you were very good at empathy, you were very good at understanding emotions, networking, etc. But you were rubbish at reading maths. And there's a whole list of stereotypes that experimental psychology, who also joined in on the kind of emergence of brain science, helpfully produced. So there was a kind of go-to list about feminine characters. Similarly, with males, if you had a manly brain, you were very good at logic, rationale, spatial thinking, you were going to be good at science. You were actually rubbish at listening, no good at understanding emotions, and there was a whole load of similar characteristics. And the next, or the end stage of that argument, was the fact that, with this type of brain, these kind of characteristics, these are the kind of jobs you would be good at, and that would determine your role in society. You would be good at being a nurse, nurturing, caring, a great wife and mother, quote some of our 19th century male scientists. Whereas if you had this kind of brain, it meant you were going to be brilliant at science, you could be a creator, an explorer, a leader, a world leader, etc., or you could be a leader of the army, etc. So it was really a lot about, men the world champions, men the winners, and women the wives and mothers. So that was very much the chain of thinking that arrived at the end of the last century, when at last we started being able to look at the brain properly and say, early scientists pursuing this hunt the difference, because they were all saying, obviously female brains must be different because women are inferior. They did move on slightly to the idea that they weren't necessarily inferior, but their skills were complementary. So they could be good wives and mothers and good wifely supports to their hugely high achieving husbands, etc. So these were the complementary skills, but there was still an inbuilt idea that brains. And so we then came to the end of the last century when we could look at brains. But the hunt the difference agenda actually continued. So there was a lot of work, rather than taking a step back and saying, okay, let's have a look and see really what brains are like, really how they work, really how they solve problems. Let's not, categorize them into males and females. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. It started with people saying, oh, let's take a group of females, group of males, look at their brains and find some differences. And that'll start to support the arguments we've already put forward. So we need to say, okay, so that's how we arrived at this kind of argument. What comes next? And let's see how we've done in the 21st century, bearing in mind this kind of chain of argument. Now, if you just said, as a neuroscientist, or perhaps as a journalist writing about neuroscience, let's go and have a look at the amount of research that's been done on sex differences in the brain. Let's have a count up of the research canon since the 1990s, when people had brain imaging techniques. You get papers almost invariably talking about sex differences in the adult human brain. And I would at this point pause and say that last chain of argument really was showing how the idea of sex differences, a biologically determined difference, led to a societal categorization of people according to their roles and their abilities. So at that point, we were assuming that sex equaled gender, what we then came to call gender, because there was only the one word initially. People talked about sex roles, about sex differences. Now, interestingly, as we'll come back to, that shifted a bit. So we now talk about gender and gender gaps, etc. So the idea is that neuroscientists like me would be doing research, they would be publishing their research, and a journalist would come along and say, there are thousands of papers reporting sex differences in the adult human brain. So there must be some, because there's all of these papers. The participant groups are getting bigger because labs are sharing their data. So we've got 5,000 brains we can look at. But the trouble is that actually, when you start looking very carefully at these reports, you find that they're not consistent. You find that there may be one paper talking about a finding of a sex difference in the amygdala. Males have a bigger amygdala than females. But you find another paper where they didn't find that difference, but they found a different difference. So there's a huge lack of consistency. And really what we're saying is that this idea of the female and the male brain has not stood the test of contemporary scientific research. And that's if you just look at, this is what I call the iceberg problem. That's what you look at in the published literature, bearing in mind that as scientists, our employers are always pressing us to publish lots of papers that have lots of impact, make their universities famous, etc. So we will publish those papers where we do find differences, partly because the press, for example, are much more interested in that. They want to say, at last, the truth, men and women's brains are different. They don't want to say, actually, do you know, scientists have just found they're not that different after all. They don't find that very interesting. So there's a big problem above the waterline, if you like, but also even within the papers which report differences. And again, I'm sure Lise Eliot will be talking about this later, where there's many, many measures which don't show any differences at all. So we get a misleading impression. The only things we see report differences. What we don't see is where people say, actually, these things are actually rather more similar than we thought. And Lise has just recently published this amazing meta-analysis, which is looking at all the research into this area, where she said, looking at 30 years of brain imaging research, carefully selected and assessed, there really is no good evidence that brains from men are different from the brains from females. And I think that's really important, because so many stereotypes, so many beliefs in the world, so many educational practices, organizational practices, even diverse, really well-meaning diversity and inclusion practices are based on the idea that men and women are different, men and women have skills. And with respect to that, if you also look at the behavioral differences, which, this go-to list of men are like this and women are like that, you will find the same thing. What we assumed were well-established men being better at spatial thinking, women being better at language, does not stand the test of time. So you have to say that chain of argument really hasn't stood up to it. But You know, and it doesn't look like there's differences between male and female brains from brain imaging perspectives. Psychologists have to acknowledge there's not that much difference. But we still have to look at the end of that chain. Why do men and women do different things in the world? Assuming, as I do as a neuroscientist, this is somehow brain-based. And this, if you like, is the core of the argument I'm going to be talking about, is the idea that we do have these gender gaps. They are gender gaps based on cognitive skills and abilities. And if, you know, where are they coming from? If it looks like the questions we've been asking so far, or the assumptions we've been making are not right, we must have a look at some other factor, which is changing our brains, because I'm assuming this is still a reflection of differences in brain characteristics. So again, alongside the World Economic Forum report of the Gender Gap Index in 2021, there's a report from UNESCO just come out looking at science. And as Cecilia mentioned, it's an area I'm very interested in, is the underrepresentation of women in science. I mean, science anyway is desperately short of scientists of any kind. So if 52% of the population are not engaging, it's something science needs to look at. And this report looked very carefully at the different kinds of sciences in the world, pointed out that women make up 28% of third level graduates in engineering, only 28%, only 22% professionals working in the field of artificial intelligence are women. And these are sciences, these are careers of the future. So this is really bad news for these careers and for women if they are not engaging. And we need to ask questions why. And here's an indication of what they call emerging jobs, the kind of jobs which are looking much more to be new kind of jobs in the future. Tiny changes in gender composition in these jobs in the world. So what are we looking at? The other aspect that I mentioned, and I think is mentioned in my abstract, was one of the ideas that from the end of the 18th century was that these kind of male-female differences were due to differences in male-female brains, and this is what they call the essentialist argument. There was some kind of biological imperative underlying these gender gaps, with the not always unspoken acknowledgement that therefore, if it was naturally determined, we shouldn't mess around with it. We should acknowledge it. We should devise our society to encompass these differences. And if you tried in any way to overcome this kind of biological determinants, these essential characteristics of males and females, would cause problems. Now, what is emerging recently is an interest in the underrepresentation of women in science as a function of the gender equality in different countries. And there was a paper came out in 2018, which said, actually, if you look at gender gaps in different countries, and you remember I mentioned Scandinavia, Iceland, etc., as being, you know, the narrowest gender gaps, and you correlate their gender gap index with the representation of women in science in those countries, something very strange emerges. And that is those countries with the narrowest gender gaps appear to have proportionally the widest lack of representation, the biggest lack of representation of women in science. Now, why I'm interested in this and why it worries me is that there is a kind of undercurrent, or not always undercurrent actually, of an essentialist argument being rewritten in 21st century terms. It says, assuming a level playing field, and you can see my view on this level playing field by this image that I've selected to illustrate the level playing field. Assuming a level playing field in these countries, we give women opportunities to choose science. And what happens? They don't choose science. And we're starting to get references to endogenous characteristics. Women are biologically determined to prefer people to things. Science is much more to do with things, and that's why they don't choose science, because they want to do people, they want to do humanities, they want to do history, English, etc. Now, you know, there's about 6 different talks in all of the assumptions underlying that, particularly among scientists, the idea that you don't deal with people, you deal with things, which is something as a scientist I might like to challenge people making these assumptions. But it's still an argument. You can't just say, well, clearly they're wrong. You've got to find out what's going on. These data, I mean, we are looking at correlations. We do need to say, is this really a good measure of gender gap, which is another 2 talks at least. But we need to say, what is going on? Why aren't women choosing to do science? And I focus on this because I think it's a really interesting understanding of much wider issues. I think it proves a nice case study. And this is my particular perspective on what neuroscience can contribute to this argument. So bringing different understanding, 21st understandings of how the brain works, what our brains are for, and what this might tell us about gender gaps in this particular issue with respect to the science. So this image here is saying, okay, we have a brain. What is it for? You'll notice I've embedded it in a world. And how might it interact with our world? Because clearly the essentialist argument we were looking at earlier is very much an internal argument. It's what's going on inside the brain, the unfolding of a genotype, a biologically determined script, if you like. Maybe we should actually be understanding how the brain interacts with the world, or the world interacts with the brain. Maybe there's much more to an understanding of that to explain gender gaps. So I'll briefly run you through these, what I call the 3 Ps, which is a helpful way, hopefully, of understanding these new processes. And each of these understandings of the brain, which have really only emerged since we've been able to look at the brain properly with brain imaging, with a much more complex understanding of human behavior. And the most important, probably, is that our brains are like predictive texters. Our brains actually are not just passive recipients of information. We now understand that our brains are constantly making predictions about what information is going to arrive next and moving us on if we don't need to pay attention to it. And this is a kind of simplistic way, obviously, of characterizing the brain, but it's a useful way of acknowledging that our brain is constantly scanning the horizons, if you like. What's going to happen next? We don't need to bother about this. That usually means this. That sight means this. That sound means that. But it's also to do with much more complicated rules of behavior. So it's not just this flash of light means this, or this sound means that word. It's understanding how other people respond. And we'll come to that, because the brain is also not just to do with ourselves being driven like an autonomous vehicle through the world. It's our brain allowing us to interact with other people. And in order to do that, we need to understand rules in the outside world. So bear in mind that our brains are constantly generating rules which will determine our behavior based on the rules they find in the outside world. We also need to understand that our brains are plastic. The essentialist argument that I told you to forget beforehand is really understanding that we had this model of the brain, that the brain got bigger. You know, you were born with your adult number of neurons, the brain got bigger as the connections were made between them. There was a universal unfolding of skills associated with the growth of the brain. And it reached its adult endpoint, its developmental endpoint, and there it stayed. And that was the brain you had, and the skills that came with it were the skills that would carry you through the rest of the world, the rest of your life. But we now know that even throughout our adult life, right up to our aging brains, and even in those brains, our brains change all the time as the experiences they have. The image I've used here is an image of really interesting set of studies done on London taxi drivers, learning an enormously complex visuospatial task, understanding, manipulating, and learning by heart, by rote, all of the routes within 6 miles of Charing Cross Station in London, if any of you have ever been to London. So really, really complicated. It takes about 3 or 4 years on average, longer for some people. And if you look at the brains of taxi drivers before they start to acquire the knowledge, as it's called, while they're practicing as taxi drivers, and really interestingly, I think, once they've stopped being taxi drivers, you can see that brain characteristics wax and wane as a function of these experiences. And this is true of a huge range of experiences. And in a way, those of us involved in education, you think, well, I'm really glad that's right, because in a way, if our brains don't change as a function of experiences, what are we as teachers doing? You know, we want to change the brains because we want people to acquire skills and practice them in the outside world. But that understanding that our brain was plastic is actually in adulthood and throughout our lives is new and important. The other aspect is that our brains are what I call permeable, partly to give me the third P. But what it really means is that we understand that the brains will solve exactly the same problem, but they will solve that problem differently depending on the context. So if you say to one group of people, this is the kind of task that people like you are really good at, and I want to see what happens in your brain when you're solving the problem. You say to another group of people, this is the kind of task that people like you, and I use that term advisedly, struggle with. So I want to see what happens in your brain when you're trying to solve this problem. So exactly the same problem, different social contexts. And you will find the brain responds differently. People who are given the positive message, the useful or appropriate areas in the brain will be activated and they will make far fewer mistakes. People who are given the negative message, the areas of the brain which are most active are those areas which, as we'll see shortly, are involved with emotional processing, negative concerns, error evaluation. So the information you get from the outside world will affect how your brain interacts with that outside world. So these are the three processes which are the biggest breakthroughs. The other aspect that we need to understand is that our brains are wired to be social. We need to belong. Our brains don't just allow us to be somebody who's developed language, somebody who might solve an amazing problem in science or write the most wonderful literature, etc. One of the key things about the human race, and possibly the key to our survival, is that we understand other people. We have a sense of self, we know who we are, we have a social identity of some kind, but we also have a sense of other people. And we have a sense of groups of other people. So we understand how important it is to belong. What are the rules of that in-group that I want to belong to? What are the rules of the out-group that I want to belong to? We understand social rules and social scripts. And if you had a series of studies, as I've been involved in, looking at the kind of social aspects of the brain, the kind of social knowledge that we have, that is powerfully represented in the newest areas of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. So there's part of our brain which makes us social. And linked to that, and this is this part of the brain here, linked to that is a part of the brain which, if you like, gives positive or negative valence to those social experiences. So, I mean, I've color-coded them according to Pixar figures here, but really it's the kind of very basic emotions. If something makes us feel good, some kind of social interaction, you'll get a positive coding. If something makes us feel bad or angry, you'll get a negative coding. But associated with that coding, and I've put a big red circle around this because this is where my own area of research is really interested, and I think a key to some of the key questions we should be asking about guts is a part of the brain which I've characterized as like a traffic light system. It's really what we call in the business the go, no-go center. It's a powerful inhibitory has a powerful inhibitory influence on situations, knowledge, activities which have been coded negatively. So if you are in some kind of social situation where you're out of your depth or it clearly doesn't belong to your, you're not with your in-group, that will attract negative coding and your brain will determine your behavior such that you extract yourself from that situation, you avoid any approach to that situation in the future, you rethink your self-identity in terms of this is not somewhere where I belong. And just briefly to indicate,
sorry, Gina, sorry to interrupt you. I just noticed you have 5 minutes or
right.
So.
5 minutes.
Sorry.
Okay, that should be just right. Okay, thank you.
Okay, sorry.
Right. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, okay. So sorry to interpret, I might start to talk a bit quicker. This is really to talk about some of the work which I've done, which demonstrates when you put people in a situation where, a social situation, where something negative happens, that there's a blow to their self-identity, people, they overhear, in inverted commas, a conversation describing them as boring, for example, or they experience a video game where they're socially rejected, or they're asked to ponder a self-image where they're fairly low down the pecking order, or they're asked to muse on a mistake they've made, whether or not that's actually been their fault, etc. So there is all social aspects of the brain, and all of those areas of the brain which are activated are to do with the activity of this part of the brain here. But also, interestingly, those areas of the brain which are activated when you experience a negative social event are the same areas of the brain activated when you suffer real pain. So that is a very good illustration of how powerful a driver it is to belong, and how, given our basic survival instinct, you will try and avoid situations where you have that lack of sense of belonging. And we know that people who have high levels of activity, either within specific situations because of behavioral problems such as depression, etc., people who have a poor self-image, who are very sensitive to being rejected, high levels of self-criticism, or what we call self-silencing, where they kind of damp down their self-identity and don't intervene in any situation, don't engage in situations, take a back seat, if you like. All of those patterns of activity are associated with this go-no-go area in the brain. So moving on quickly, given I've now got about 3 minutes, what is this to do with telling us about gender gaps, why women don't do science? And that's really to say, if you look at the outside world in terms of somebody who might be contemplating science, it's full of stereotypes that scientists are not females. There's, I'm too pretty to do maths. There's this kind of girls are bad at maths, etc. And very young children, less than 6 years old, will buy into this idea that girls were saying, I'm not really clever, I'm not a scientist. It also starts very early in terms of the kind of experiences you have. If you remember, I said that the world, we have a plastic brain, and the experiences we have will change the brain. One of the supposedly robust differences, male-female differences, is that males are better at spatial skills. But we now know that spatial skills are much more a function of visuospatial training and opportunity than sex. So if you look at the kind of toys that children are given to play with, it's much more likely that males, young boys, will be given construction-type spatial skills, and girls will be given more creative toys like balls. I've just briefly drawn a picture of Michelle's attempt to deal with this with Barbie the engineer, saying trying to encourage girls to be engineers, pointing out that in fact what Barbie the engineer can make is a pink washing machine or a pink jewelry carousel. So we might need to think about what our female brain is picking up from the outside world. The other kind of things which I'm sure you're familiar with is occasional public outbursts about science wasting its time educating women. They're not biologically suited to do science. You've got the Google engineer who said Google was wasting its time with diversity initiatives because women differ in part due to biological causes. So they're not really suitable to be Google engineers. And similarly, a physicist in CERN saying physics was throwing a lot of money at trying to educate women physicists, and physics is a man's game, quote. And also the idea, I won't go into this in detail because I don't have time now, but the idea that embedded in lots and lots of disciplines in the heads of both male and female exponents of those disciplines is the idea that to be successful in science, you need to be born a genius. There's some kind of innate ability. And if you correlate that belief with the representation of women in science, you find those sciences which have the strongest belief in some kind of innate ability which will make you successful are also those sciences where there's the greatest underrepresentation of women. So within the sciences themselves, we have physics, maths, engineering, and computer science. So the reason I think this is a brain problem still is not to do with women can't do science, which is what our 18th century, 19th century scientists were telling us. This is the women's brains being told, I'm looking at science. Do I have the skills to do science? If you're told from the age of 6 that, maths is a boy's skill, probably your answer might be no. You look at science, how many people are there like me in that environment? Will I be included or excluded? If you look at science as it's currently constituted, looking at the gender gaps, the answer might be no. If you look at evidence about reward systems within science and gender bias within those reward systems, something which interestingly is emerging as a big problem within scientific journals, for example, it's quite clear that there's a gender bias in who gets acknowledged, who gets rewarded, etc. And so if self-esteem is really important to you and you're contemplating going into an area where your anterior-cingulate your traffic light system is actually saying, I really don't think this is for you, it's still a brain problem. But it's not a brain problem which has arisen from some kind of internal lack of ability or differential ability. It's something which the world has trained our brains to acknowledge. And therefore we need to say, if we need to understand or to do something about gender gaps, why is it that there are these gender gaps? And we need to say, let's have a look at how the brain works. If we're going to encourage diversity and inclusivity initiatives, we must think about the inclusivity as well. It's not just enough to have, to buy in lots and lots of people and say, oh, well, we've improved the gender ratio within our discipline. We need to look at the culture of that discipline. Is it welcome? Is it indeed a level playing field? Or are we going to land up with this kind of going into the future, desperate underrepresentation of women in science and the implications that will have for women themselves, for the world itself, and for science as a whole? So hopefully I'm just within time, and
yes,
we'll have time for questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Sheena. I think I can talk for the audience. The talk was inspiring, so thank you very much. There are some questions from the public, so I have my own, but I'm going to give the voice to the public.
Right. Okay.
So and I think that one of the questions that appeared in the chat was from Agostina, and she was wondering about there is something about how these questions appear and the methodologies and the conclusions that this kind of research about sex difference appear in all through time and history. And she says that the feminist philosophy of science has this idea that there's something behind this funding and promoting this kind of investigation. So the question is, what do you think about this? What do you think about the motivations behind finding biological reasons for sex differences? And what should we do about it?
Yes. Well, a lot of it is to do with the status quo, if you like. And certainly that's how the early brain research, it just took the status quo without challenging it, saying, let's have a look at society, look at women's place in society, hierarchies of achievement. And bearing in mind, I've obviously just been talking about gender, but there's a lot to do with class, a lot to do with race, a lot to do with disability as well, as we still see in the world today. And so there's a kind of inbuilt belief among those for whom the status quo plays out well, to maintain the status quo. Now, if you have a belief that something is biological, and this is a very powerful belief, you believe it shouldn't be changed, which again is something that you could think about. If you think there's a biological problem, we try and cure illnesses, etc. But there is this understanding that if something is natural, and the term essential is interesting because essential, I don't know how that word translates into Spanish, but essential within the scientific phrase means an essence, a biologically determined characteristic. But in English, certainly, essential also means really, really important, something that you must have. So to take a biological argument to maintain the status quo is a very good line to follow, because you're saying this is how it is, and then you get the kind of altruistic approach that, it's a shame that more people aren't able to do this, but they're just biologically incapable, etc. So it's a powerful argument. I'm not necessarily talking about sort of sinister political motives, but it is the case that there is this belief that men and women, the idea of the female brain is still a term that is used, despite, as I said many times, I'm sure Lise will be telling you, look at the evidence. There is, my brain will be different from your brain for all sorts of different reasons. And yet sometimes people just say, is this person male or female? So that's all you need to know. And there's also this belief that because it's fixed, you shouldn't waste your time trying to change it. Because in the 1980s, there was a big backlash against the essentialist view. And they're saying nothing to do with biology. It's all to do with what society makes people do, makes men and women do differently. And we can change that, and that's going to be great. And of course, then you look at the gender gaps as evidenced in the World Economic Forum report that's just come out. Nothing much has come of that belief. And so a lot of people were saying, oh, we're making the playing field level and things aren't changing. So therefore, we are looking at a natural difference. What we need to do is challenge the idea that the playing field is in any way level, but also assuming that, biology isn't in some way responsive to what goes on in the outside world, and look at evolution, if you like. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, amazing. And I think that you also answer other questions that appear in the chat. And I'm going to compile a couple of questions. And I'm going to bring something that I read that you said in an interview, that somebody asked you, okay, can I go to your lab? Can you scan my brain? Can you tell me whether I'm female or I'm male? Just to be in a binary code. And you answered something that it was very funny to me. And you said something like, I'm going to read, I'm sorry, there isn't any such a thing.
And there were a lot brain.
I wanted to come back to this because there are a lot of questions saying, but isn't it true that there is some parts that they're bigger? So if you want to comment a little bit on that.
I will indeed. I mean, what you're referring to is the whole issue, the transgender issue. And within that community, there are sort of simplistic statements, I feel, but which become possibly a misunderstanding. People talking about having a female brain in a male body. And I have been asked by males, a male in particular, but more than one, who wants to transition. So if you could scan my brain, show that it's female, then I can win the argument, because I can prove that I want to change my body, so I want to prove I just want to match it with my brain. This is where I say there is no such thing as a female brain. There is no template. I can't, as an imager, I can't look at a brain and say that's from a male or that's from a female. The only difference might be that male brains, on average, and that goes right back to the beginning, the diagram I showed, a huge amount of overlap. On average, male brains are 8%, 10% bigger than female brains, but that's because males on average are 8%, 10% bigger than females. So the brain is just another organ which is scaled according to the size of the body it's in, and it has no significance. But in people, certainly early on, that was the answer. Men's brains on average were 5 ounces heavier, and this is why they were kings and emperors and winners, etc. So the size of the structures actually does not tell us anything useful about the function. And that neuroscientists themselves have contributed to that belief, because they will talk about people who are good at reading. No, that's not a very good example. People are good at spotting detailed differences in patterns, greater activation in the visual area, as though there is some kind of direct link between the size and what it can do. And that is not the case. And I think that's really important, because a lot of the research you look at is sex differences, which then gets translated into proof at last in popular literature, popular media. Men have got a bigger amygdala. And the fact that actually, if you look at another set of studies, or you look at the overall meta-analyses findings, they haven't got a bigger amygdala. And I think neuroscience has painted itself into the corner in still looking at the size of structures to tell us anything useful about male and female abilities, masculine and feminine, if you like, if you still want to tie to the binary approach, which is another issue. So I think that's the key thing. I mean, neuroscience themselves are still selling the idea of this is bigger than that, as though that's an important source of information. I'm not a sex difference denier, which is another one of the more polite epithets which has been leveled at me. I do believe that there are sex differences in the brain, quite possible, but certainly related to reproductive, the male and female roles in reproduction. So hormone receptors will be different in females, brains of females as opposed to brains of males. But again, you're looking at a big overlap. It's not as though all females have this number of hormone estrogen receptors and all males have this number of testosterone receptors. So that's really important, because again, it's a nice simplistic belief, because on that you can then say, oh, well, I'll teach girls differently because they're like this. Or employers will say women are better at these kind of tasks. Or women themselves will say women have got unique skills which we can bring to the table, which you should say I should keep quiet about and agree. But I'm afraid that's not true. Science doesn't support that. And any, however well-meaning initiative which is based on this idea is going to fail. And people will then look at those initiatives and say, oh, we've leveled the playing field and look what happens, women don't do science. So it's a real understanding that what our brains do is much more entangled with what the world is like than we ever realized. And we need to acknowledge that in order to understand why males and females appear to be different.
Amazing. I think that you answered like half of the questions that appear in the chat with this part. So I'm really, really happy. We have just a couple of minutes, and I wanted to just thank you again and ask you if you want to close with something that you left behind, because I make you hurry up at the end.
You were quite right.
but just I mean, in the last minute, if you want to finish with something, please, I will give you the space.
Okay. I think the key issue is people say, you know, what can we do about this? And they talk about gender neutrality. You know, will we ever reach a gender neutral world? And I think a lot of these difficulties that we encounter is to do with we're still focusing on gender as a key factor. And I'm using gender in the 21st century terms actually to incorporate a bit of biology as well. So, you know, again, that's another 5 talks probably on the difference between sex and gender. But to say that, you know, the way forward is probably gender irrelevance. Can we just stop focusing on whether people are male or female or masculine or feminine? I think there are much more interesting and useful questions to ask. And that's the best way forward. You know, teachers don't think of boys are like this and girls are like that. Parents, you know, don't think of my sons, my daughters. And certainly parents with more than one child or more than one child of the same kind, etc., will realize that people are different, are individual. And we've all got brains, so there's something else is making us different. And I don't think it's all biology. But even if it is, even if in 50 years' time we found amazing ways of characterizing individual brains and find that we can group them all into these are the characteristics of the brains of people with an XY genotype, and these are the brains of people with an XX genotype, I don't think that'll happen. But even if we did, within that, there'd be huge differences. And it's much more interesting to focus on the differences within whatever groups you want to make than to look at tiny differences between those groups, which is what the whole history of sex difference has been about. No, that's not very
amazing. No, thank you. Thank you.
A gendered world, make a gender brain, that will do.
Nice. Yeah, I was going to finish with your line, every brain is different from every brain. So I think that you finish with that, and it's a powerful message to where to focus our attention. So thank you very much, Gina. You're an amazing speaker.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. And thank you for asking me. And hopefully I'll come and see you in real time.
Yes. This is a date next year in Argentina. So don't
Excellent.
worry.
Okay, good. I'll be there.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Gina. Thank you very much. And now we are going to go to the second talk from this event. I welcome you, Gina, to stay if you want.
Thank you.
And I'm going to switch back to Spanish, así que voy a volver al español. En algún momento esto de ir y venir me va a pesar, pero bueno. Y bueno, a continuación tengo el enorme placer de presentar a Mariano Narodowski y a Verónica Stewart. Hola Mariano, hola Verónica. Los vi que entraron a la sala, así que si quieren ir prendiendo sus cámaras. Hola, muchas gracias por estar hoy acá.
Gracias, Cecilia. Muchas gracias por la invitación.
Cecilia, gracias.
No, por favor, gracias por decir que sí. Y les quiero contar un poquito, sí, sé que el tiempo en estos momentos, el tiempo es tirano, así que les quiero contar que Verónica es licenciada en periodismo y es especialista en políticas educativas por la Universidad Torcuato Di Tella, y actualmente está escribiendo su tesis de maestría, así que estamos muy contentos, porque su tesis se trata sobre infancias trans en la escuela moderna. Ella se ha desempeñado como asistente de investigación en el diseño de modelo de formación, de articulación entre educación media y praxis a nivel secundario en el CEPE. Esta propuesta fue elaborada para el Ministerio de Educación de la Ciudad de Buenos Aires. También es asistente de investigación en la Di Tella, es docente de lengua y literatura inglesa a nivel secundario. Así que bueno, es un placer, Verónica, tenerte hoy acá con nosotros.
Muchas gracias.
De nada, y la va a acompañar Mariano Narodowski, que es profesor e investigador también de la casa y del área de educación de la Universidad Torcuato Di Tella. Mariano ha publicado muchísimos libros sobre política educativa y pedagogía, y yo diría que tiene varias decenas, ¿no? O cientos de artículos en diferentes revistas, tanto científicas como de divulgación, que se especializan en la educación y en las ciencias sociales. Mariano también fue ministro de Educación de la Ciudad de Buenos Aires, y actualmente es miembro académico del Consejo Nacional de Calidad de la Educación de la Argentina y del Consejo Asesor de la Organización de los Estados Iberoamericanos de la Educación, de la Ciencia y la Cultura. Así que bueno, muchísimas gracias de nuevo. Ellos hoy nos van a hablar sobre infancias trans, la frontera final para las escuelas, que creo que es un tema muy relevante en este momento, y que nos permite tomar a las ciencias del comportamiento y pensarlas en un espacio real como son las escuelas. Así que bueno, les dejo, sin tardar más, les dejo el espacio para que comiencen sus presentaciones.
Bueno, buen día, buenas tardes, yo no sé ni qué hora es. Buenas tardes a todos y a todas. ¿Estás por ahí, Vero?
Estoy acá.
Ok. Bueno, forma parte de una investigación que estamos desarrollando y que tiene algunos subproductos que ya están publicados, que lo estamos haciendo, digamos, la autora principal es Verónica, porque es la que más está trabajando estos temas, y además también cuenta con la participación de Delfina Campetela, que creo que anda por ahí también. Es un tema, digamos, que es muy controversial desde el punto de vista político y desde el punto de vista moral. Nosotros no nos vamos a meter con lo político, ni mucho menos con lo moral. Simplemente lo que estamos tratando de entender es qué significa la obligación incluso de aceptación legal de las infancias trans en las instituciones escolares de la modernidad, en este caso aplicadas a la Argentina, básicamente porque en la Argentina tenemos una ley que permite que los chicos y chicas trans puedan optar en términos de sus preferencias. Así que, bueno, si querés, Vero, te toca a vos primero.
Dale. ¿Querés pasar? Perfecto. Bueno, como Mariano muy bien decía, nos estamos centrando en la Argentina porque tenemos una ley desde el 2012, la ley 26.743, que es la ley de identidad de género. Esta ley determina, nos centramos en lo que tiene que ver con los menores de edad, es el tema que estamos tratando. Esta ley establece que el cambio en el registro y el permiso para hacer tratamientos médicos necesita el aval de un representante legal, pero que con el solo pedido del menor, el solo requerimiento del menor, el nombre de pila elegido tiene que ser utilizado en el ámbito público y privado. Esto tiene que ver también con la escuela, por supuesto aplica a la escuela. Encontramos, cuando empezamos a investigar este tema, que la literatura académica en general era sobre cómo los alumnos trans podían adaptarse a la escuela, o cómo podían ser incorporados a la escuela, tenía que ver con la discriminación, que por supuesto es un tema importante, pero no había nada sobre lo inverso, digamos, cómo tiene que hacer la escuela para adaptarse a los alumnos trans. Esto que decía Mariano de la obligación es muy importante, porque de repente comunidades escolares enteras se ven obligadas a aceptar este cambio. Y como vamos a ver en esta presentación, el efecto de esto no tiene que ver solo con algo concreto en el ámbito del currículo, en el ámbito del control del cuerpo, del baño y de la educación física, sino que esta regulación afecta a la tecnología escolar desde sus bases. Queremos también resaltar que esta ley se engloba dentro de tendencias legales mayores, tanto en la Argentina como en el resto del mundo. En la Argentina, en materia de derechos LGBT, en el 2010 habíamos conseguido la legalización del matrimonio igualitario, y en general, en el mundo, ahí se está pasando de un modelo tutelar a un modelo en el que el niño es considerado un sujeto de derecho por sí mismo, sin la necesidad constante de que un tutor avale cualquier cosa que pida legalmente. Así que lo que vamos a hacer ahora es un poco pensar en cómo esta regulación afecta a la tecnología escolar y cómo diluye identidades fijas sobre las que reposa la organización de la escuela moderna como institución.
Bueno, para entender un poco más de qué estamos hablando, cuál es el escenario en el que nos estamos desenvolviendo, primero hay que entender que la infancia es un constructo histórico de la modernidad, es decir, no es una presencia meramente biológica sobre la cual se inscriben determinados discursos, sino que probablemente a partir de los siglos XVI y XVII se produce una ruptura muy significativa en el sentimiento de infancia, que se da en distintas regiones en forma completamente asincrónica y obviamente con las diferencias culturales correspondientes, pero que tiene un elemento central, y es la identificación de la infancia en tanto cuerpos heterónomos, es decir, a los que se les adjudica la incapacidad de generar una ley propia, y que por lo tanto precisan o requieren de la ley de un otro, que en este caso es un adulto, hasta el momento de su emancipación, tanto desde el punto de vista filosófico en términos kantianos, como desde el punto de vista legal de cualquier legislación. La emancipación supone que las personas pueden autogobernarse. En tanto autogobierno, pueden tomar sus propias decisiones y asumir sus propias responsabilidades. Por eso la emancipación también es el fin de la inimputabilidad penal, por ejemplo. La emancipación es el momento en donde las personas están habilitadas para casarse, para comprar y vender propiedades, etcétera, sin la necesidad del aval de un adulto. En el caso de la vida familiar, el adulto es el padre o la madre, es lo que habitualmente se llama la patria potestad, que es un concepto muy antiguo, tiene que ver con el derecho romano, que originalmente fue de los padres, y que ahora en la mayoría de los países del mundo es de los padres y de las madres, compartida. Y en el caso de la escuela, esa contraparte adulta está encarnada por el docente. Y por otro lado, la infancia también se define como carente, si la definimos en la modernidad como esos cuerpos que necesitan ser completados, como esas instancias que necesitan de un otro para ser desarrollados. Esto es, muy sucintamente, el punto de partida o la justificación de la pedagogía para intervenir en la educación escolar, por medio de la tecnología escolar. Es decir, desde que la educación se incrustó en el proceso evolutivo hace cientos de miles de años, esa incrustación a partir del siglo XVII toma un carril particular, que es la escuela o es la tecnología escolar, y es la pedagogía en tanto disciplina sistemática, articulada, porque pedagogía natural o implícita hubo desde siempre, es una reflexión sobre cómo enseñar mejor, hubo siempre, pero en este caso la pedagogía toma esta heteronomía y esta carencia como justificación o punto de partida para su intervención. Entonces, de esta manera se configura un alumno de la modernidad, que es ese cuerpo que necesita de la guía, de la protección, del cuidado docente, una relación de carácter bifronte, porque por un lado el docente lo tiene que formar, lo tiene que cuidar, lo tiene que proteger, pero por otro lado lo tiene que corregir, y a veces esta mezcla de cariño con severidad es la marca propia de la constitución de la docencia moderna. ese adulto ocupa el lugar del saber, y esto en términos estructuralistas quiere decir que no importa si sabe o no sabe, importa que ocupa ese lugar y sea reconocido en tanto tal, y también una simetría fundante, es decir, que esa relación docente-alumnos no es una relación entre pares, no es una relación entre equivalentes, no es una relación simétrica, sino que es una relación de carácter asimétrico, donde el docente tiene que amar, cuidar, formar, acompañar, proteger a los alumnos, pero los alumnos no están obligados a hacer la recíproca. Y esta situación, nuestra infancia como dispositivo, se tramita, en términos de Margaret Mead, en un formato posfigurativo. Perdón, está mal esto, ese es un formato prefigurativo, no sé hacer PowerPoint, odio los PowerPoint si no lo sé hacer bien. Es un formato posfigurativo, está bien. Es un formato posfigurativo, es decir, de los grandes a los chicos, de los viejos a los jóvenes, y por lo tanto de flujo intergeneracional vertical y jerárquico. ¿Qué significa eso? Que la tecnología escolar y la infancia como dispositivo de esta tecnología requiere de que el flujo de datos, el flujo de información, la transmisión de conocimientos, esté basada centralmente en forma vertical, es decir, de los grandes a los chicos en forma simétrica, y jerárquico, es decir, que esa relación no se pueda corromper por algunas cuestiones que pasan. Esto es un tema muy importante porque, como vamos a ver ahora, nuestra cultura ya no es más una cultura posfigurativa, es una cultura que se ha horizontalizado, y los lugares de los adultos y de los niños ya no son lugares fijos, sino que tienen enormes niveles de interacción, complejidad y flexibilidad.
Bueno, muchas de las cosas que comentó Mariano ahora las voy a volver a mencionar, porque cuando pensábamos, bueno, en esto de las infancias trans, teníamos que pensar por un lado en qué entendemos por infancia, y qué entendemos también por género, para entender el transgénero a raíz de eso. El género lo vamos a entender desde una teoría feminista, lo vamos a entender como las representaciones y prácticas desarrolladas desde la diferencia anatómica. O sea, lo que se hizo históricamente fue pensar el género desde un lugar biologicista. A tal genitalidad le corresponden tales características, ¿no? Entonces, una cosa que es interesante y que hablábamos mientras hacíamos el paper es que tanto el género como la infancia comparten que son lecturas sociales sobre una realidad biológica. O sea, al niño, que es una persona en desarrollo, se la lee socialmente como un niño moderno, y a una persona con genitales femeninos se la lee socialmente como una mujer, lo mismo masculinos como un hombre, con todo lo que eso implica. La escuela hace exactamente esto, o sea, las bases de la escuela son biologicistas, y a raíz de este binarismo divide cuestiones de trabajo, de poder, de moral, de afectividad. Lo pensamos como un significante binario que distribuye socialmente estas potencialidades, estas predicciones, estas posiciones grupales. Judith Butler habla específicamente de la teoría de la performatividad, y lo que ella dice es que nosotros recibimos significantes, pero también los resignificamos. Esto quiere decir que el género no es un atributo, sino que es una práctica social reiterativa, es un hacer más que un ser. Entonces el sujeto actúa con normas genéricas que legitiman y excluyen. Esto quiere decir que no puede actuar como más le satisfaga, sino que actúa a ciertas normas que ya están establecidas. Sin embargo, estas normas pierden valor si no se actúa sobre ellas. Hay que actuarlas, hay que hacer como perform them, como sería por eso la teoría de la performatividad, para que tengan sentido, para que se sostengan. Lo cual quiere decir que hay una disputa, una resignificación, una renegociación constante entre este hacer y estas normas que determinan este hacer. La escuela es uno de los campos principales en los que sucede esta disputa. La escuela regula cuerpos y comportamientos constantemente, no solo en términos de género, vamos a pensarlo exclusivamente, en este caso en términos de género, y lo hace siempre partiendo de una hegemonía. La hegemonía es la heterosis norma, la heterosexualidad y el cisgénero como las narrativas del deber ser. Esto quiere decir que los alumnos heterosis van a encontrar en la escuela herramientas suficientes para definirse, van a encontrar una narrativa que los identifique, que los represente, mientras que todo alumno que esté por fuera de esa hegemonía no lo va a encontrar, y ahí vamos a encontrar la disrupción de la que estamos hablando, porque la escuela piensa el sexo como un equivalente del género, y lo que nos parecía interesante para plantear acá es que los alumnos trans lo que hacen es poner en evidencia que eso no sucede de esa manera. Antes de pensar en eso, quería mencionar un poco los dispositivos escolares que actúan en pos de esta heteronorma. Tenemos como dos categorías principales: por un lado los que suceden por medio del currículum, y por otro lado los ámbitos que tienen que ver con el control del cuerpo. Cuando hablamos de currículum, hablamos de algo que todos conocemos, que tiene que ver con los contenidos dictados en cada materia, lo que dice el Ministerio de Educación, que se tiene que dar en matemática, en historia, en lengua. Pero hay otra forma de currículum, que es lo que llamamos el currículum oculto, que lo vamos a definir como el proceso de transmisión de normas implícitas, valores y creencias que subyacen en las formas culturales utilizadas por la escuela. Es todo aquello que la escuela enseña sin proponerse explícitamente enseñarlo. Esto a los docentes, a los directivos, nos sucede en muchos casos inconscientemente incluso, porque está en las bases mismas de la escuela moderna. Y este currículum oculto es valorativo, es normativo, marca, como decíamos antes, el deber ser. Lo que hace es predicciones, piensa en roles de género, entonces piensa en estereotipos también. Esto lo vemos mucho en, por ejemplo, esto lo escucho yo como docente todos los días en los pasillos del colegio en el que trabajo. Bueno, este grupo es un lío porque son todos varones, hay una sola chica y es la mejor alumna. Y este grupo son re tranquilas porque son todas alumnas, son todas mujeres. Entonces, sin darnos cuenta de lo que estamos haciendo, estamos transmitiendo un valor sobre eso. Lo mismo en educación física, por ejemplo. Bueno, este varón que es más fuerte, que es más rápido, que en este área se desempeña mejor porque pensamos que biológicamente tiene las características para hacerlo, mientras que a las mujeres las ponemos en un lugar que tiene más que ver con un rol más doméstico, vulnerable, de lo sensible, de lo artístico. Una investigación muy interesante, de hecho, que hizo Mariano con Pablo Narodowski, es que lo que encontraban es que esto sucede mucho en términos de masculinidades, que lo que decían es que las masculinidades se enseñan, la masculinidad no es algo nato, no es algo que biológicamente suceda, sino que es algo enseñado, impartido por la escuela. Y otras investigaciones encuentran incluso que en las áreas del recreo y en las áreas de educación física, en términos de control de cuerpo, los varones ocupan los espacios centrales, mientras que las mujeres se desempeñan en las periferias. Para mí, personalmente, pensar en esto y darme cuenta de que, claro, el patio de mi colegio tenía una cancha de fútbol gigante, siempre ocupada por los varones, y nosotras siempre jugábamos a los costados. Esto era algo pensado por nosotras como algo natural, como algo que no nos molestaba, porque no podíamos pensar que podía ser diferente. Todas estas cuestiones, este control que sucede en términos curriculares, en términos también de control de los cuerpos, se ve muy claramente en tres niveles. El primero es un nivel institucional, es el nivel en el que el género se utiliza para organizar actividades escolares. Entonces, las filas, primero pasan por acá los varones, después pasan por acá las mujeres, que se piensa como algo exclusivamente organizativo, y que, por supuesto, lo que hace es simplemente reforzar este concepto del binarismo. Por otro lado, los agentes institucionales que clasifican y que valoran, que ahí me da culpa de los docentes, que constantemente dentro del aula hacemos esto, ponemos en grupo a las mujeres, a los varones. Y el tercer nivel, que a mi entender es el más interesante, es el que sucede entre los pares, porque es el que sucede una vez incorporado en los dos niveles anteriores. Entre ellos mismos se legitiman, se hablan en términos de valor, y excluyen también a identidades que son diferentes. Un varón en un grupo de varones se pone a llorar y eso se marca como algo que está exclusivamente ligado a lo femenino, a las mujeres. En términos de control de cuerpo, hablábamos de esto de educación física, del área del recreo. También los baños lo que hacen es naturalizar estas categorías binarias, y lo que se dice es que dos géneros opuestos deben separarse cuando desnudos, y tienen que estar encerrados y divididos. Entonces la idea, por ejemplo, de un baño unisex es una idea que ocurre por hoy en muy pocas escuelas, son realmente la excepción. Y lo que sucede en el medio de todo esto es que los docentes podemos intentar romper con esto individualmente, pero estamos imprincados en un sistema que nos excede totalmente y que refuerza este binarismo constantemente, con la fijación de las expectativas de rol, con el control de los cuerpos. Entonces la tecnología escolar básicamente lo que hace es reproducir este binarismo de género, y reproducirlo asegurando, diciendo de esta manera, que es algo natural, que es algo biológico. Lo que vamos a ver ahora es que las infancias trans lo que hacen es poner en jaque esa misma idea. Podemos pasar a la próxima.
Antes quería agregar
Sí.
algo, Verónica, si me permitís, para reforzar el
Por favor.
último párrafo de la diapositiva, muy cortito, porque este binarismo es mucho más complejo que la división entre varones y mujeres. Es decir, dentro de los, vos mencionaste algo respecto del llanto del hombre macho que no debe llorar, como dice el tango. Dentro de cada uno de esos roles hay también, se dividen roles que tienen que ver con criterios de hegemonía y subalternidad. Es decir, criterios de hegemonía son el varón, el que es canchero, el que es vivo, el que sabe jugar a la pelota, el que es lindo, y el otro es el gordo, el que va al arco, el que no sabe jugar a la pelota, el tonto, el traga. Palabras que nos definen en el argot argentino porteño, un poco de esto. Exactamente lo mismo pasa con las mujeres. Y esto es muy importante, incluso en términos estadísticos, porque a pesar de lo que a veces se piensa o se predice, en el caso argentino y muchos países del mundo, el éxito escolar, entendido como eficacia, alcanzar los grados y alcanzar los títulos, es centralmente femenino. Mayor nivel de abandono escolar, sobre todo en la escuela secundaria, por ejemplo en la Argentina es un caso claro, es centralmente masculino, de varones pobres. Y eso también tiene que ver con un proceso de producción generalizada. Nosotros usualmente nos centramos más en la cuestión de las mujeres, pero también hay que ver cómo algunas masculinidades operan en términos subalternos y terminan siendo también perjudicadas. Juro que estoy intentando pasar, pero la máquina no me responde. Ahí está.
Ahí va, perfecto. Bueno, entonces, lo que nosotros planteamos en nuestro artículo es que las infancias trans lo que hacen es poner en jaque a la escuela desde un lugar muy esencial. Por un lado, desde un lugar práctico, claro, que es que la escuela tiene que adaptarse en el día a día, tiene que ver qué hacer con el uniforme del alumno, tiene que ver a qué baño puede ir, tiene que ver qué clase de educación física va a concurrir, el nombre por supuesto se cambia en la lista, pero después tiene que verse que todos los directivos y los docentes cumplan con ese cambio y traten al alumno con los pronombres que corresponden, y eso es un universo que le corresponde a cada escuela y que ya de por sí es muy complejo. Pero después hay otro nivel que no tiene que ver con cada institución particular, sino que tiene que ver con la escuela moderna como desde un nivel más conceptual, desde sus bases más conceptuales. Entonces lo que hace es, por un lado, cuestionar el biologicismo reproducido por lo escolar. Lo que dice es, las infancias trans ponen en evidencia que el género es una construcción siempre, porque la pregunta es, si ese alumno que yo hasta ayer conocía como alumna, hoy puede definirse con otro género, ¿por qué todos los alumnos y las alumnas no pueden hacer esto? ¿Por qué entonces a todos los otros alumnos y alumnas simplemente asumimos su género por su biología y no damos lugar a que suceda ese cambio o esa elección más consciente y personal? Eso por un lado. Por otro lado, Mariano, como mencionaba antes, la escuela nace en una cultura posfigurativa, donde los cambios son lentos y se acude a los mayores para recibir consejos, para recibir conocimientos, para prepararse para la vida adulta. La cultura en la que vivimos ahora es muy distinta, es una cultura prefigurativa de cambios rápidos y vertiginosos, donde lo valorado no es la tradición, sino la capacidad de adaptarse. ¿Y quién tiene más capacidad de adaptarse que los jóvenes, que los niños? Entonces, los niños hoy por hoy también se demuestran como lo que se ve mucho es que dentro de la cultura escolar el problema con todo esto está en las bases de la escuela y en los directivos, en los docentes, y no así en el resto de los compañeros, que entienden esto con una facilidad mucho mayor. Y también lo que demuestra todo esto es que, como decía Mariano también, tenemos vínculos más horizontales, se destruye la asimetría de saberes que era tan necesaria, que fue tan necesaria para fundar a la escuela. Encontramos niños que saben sobre sexualidad, que investigan sobre estos temas, que entienden qué pueden hacer con la ley que está a su disposición, y que muchas veces saben más que los adultos de este tema. Y haciendo esto también se corren del lugar de inocencia que generalmente le atribuimos a la infancia, un lugar donde la sexualidad no sucede, donde en sexo no se piensa, es un secreto de los adultos. Bueno, aquí los niños piensan su propia sexualidad y la piensan tanto que hasta ejecutan estas acciones, cambian su género para sentirse más a gusto con su propia identidad. Por otro lado, también lo que hace la presencia de las infancias trans es poner en evidencia que todo esto es una construcción, que todo esto es un artificio. Amenaza las ideas de base de la escuela, que son que tanto la infancia como la transexualidad, como el género más bien, son supuestos básicos biológicos inamovibles. Bueno, las infancias están cambiando, tenemos un tipo de sociedad diferente, donde tenemos infancias hiper realizadas, que viven en la inmediatez y en la información constante. Lo mismo sucede con el género. Ya nos corremos de un lugar biologicista, lo pensamos como un constructo social que cambia y que puede resignificarse en cada persona. Entonces, lo que termina sucediendo es que la presencia de infancias trans en la escuela pone en evidencia que todas estas bases pueden ser resignificadas también, que pueden ser revalorizadas y pueden ser discutidas. No sé si quieres agregar algo más.
Sí, sí. Hay un punto importante que tiene que ver con la dilución del perfil heterónomo y de carencia del que hablábamos antes, porque un chico trans tiene un conocimiento sobre sí mismo que a los otros no les fue dado tener. Es decir, el misterio de la sexualidad, que supuestamente es una cuestión de adultos, o era una cuestión de adultos, ahora termina siendo tramitado por un chico de 8 años, al que le reconocemos que sabe más de lo que nosotros podríamos saber sobre él. Es decir, él tramita su propio secreto. Esto es muy importante porque corroe los cimientos propios de la escolaridad moderna en la medida que rompe cualquier forma de asimetría. Es decir, nuestra cultura y la legislación reconocen que no hay nada que un adulto pueda hacer en términos de su propio conocimiento en relación con ese conocimiento que tiene el propio chico. Estoy tratando de pasar, pero frente a esto tenemos algunas preguntas, algunas que tienen más que ver un poco más con la evidencia y otras que son proyecciones para futuros trabajos y algunas cuestiones interesantes para conversar. La primera que en lo personal a muchos de nosotros más nos preocupa o más nos interesa es sobre el futuro de la tecnología escolar. No porque nos reemplacen androides o inteligencia artificial, aunque también eso debe estar cerca, sino respecto del orden moderno de lo escolar. La idea de un mundo en donde los adultos están menos legitimados y en donde las infancias hiperrealizadas, como señalaba Vero recién, tienen un rol preponderante. Esto desacopla la gramática escolar o el formato escolar o los dispositivos institucionales de la escuela, como cualquiera sea el registro teórico que quieran adoptar, y nos hace pensar en una posible disrupción, y la pregunta es si esto va a necesitar de nuevos acoples, de nuevos cambios, de nuevos embonajes, o si el formato tradicional se va a poder mantener a toda costa. Dentro de esto hay una gran pregunta que en algún sentido Verónica la aludió al principio, que es que nosotros reconocemos estos cambios, o nosotros reconocemos estas identidades trans, y eso ya en sí mismo es un cambio en el formato escolar, en la medida que no ya que haya que pensar en cómo este chico se adapta a la escuela, sino qué posibilidades o qué margen tienen las instituciones escolares de la modernidad de sobrevivir de la misma manera en cómo se tramitaba el proceso de escolarización. La segunda cuestión, que también planteó Verónica antes, es si este reconocimiento de esta identidad fomenta otros saberes y otras singularidades. Para decirlo en términos Foucaultianos, si otras singularidades se van a sublevar para que sean reconocidas de la misma manera. probablemente haya otras formas de trámite de la propia vida en términos no solamente de género, sino en términos sociales, en términos culturales, en términos religiosos o espirituales, que a veces tienen menos atención, o en este momento tienen menos atención que las cuestiones de género, que probablemente también estén en una situación de carrera como para poder reclamar o reivindicar su propia identidad. ¿Y qué va a pasar con una escuela, por lo tanto, en donde todas las identidades son más o menos válidas? Y por último, la última pregunta, que tiene que ver con cuestiones sí más estrictamente pedagógicas y organizacionales, que es lo que vemos como la respuesta de las escuelas, es cómo hace la institución escolar, cómo se fuerza la institución escolar para mantener en la medida de lo que pueda el viejo gobierno pedagógico, posfigurativo, centrado en la heteronomía y en la simetría y en la carencia, la identificación de la carencia del alumno, en un escenario de posible generalización de identidades. Esto es un trabajo que es un trabajo pedagógico, y que en gran medida es posible que esto sea lo que explica en cierta medida el malestar de los docentes, la falta de respuesta frente a ciertas cuestiones, de cómo la realidad escolar interpela la propia identidad y la propia historia de los propios docentes. Con lo cual, y volviendo al punto de partida para cerrar, el punto de partida de Vero, nos parece que acá estamos haciendo un aporte a la literatura, porque no se trata solamente de ver cómo hacen las escuelas para adaptarse, cómo hacen los chicos para adaptarse a la escuela, sino de entender qué pasa más en profundidad con la estructura misma de la institución escolar moderna, cuando una identidad reclama para sí un reconocimiento tan fuerte, y cuando la soberanía de la decisión puede recaer en un chico de 8 años, incluso menos, en la medida que nosotros le reconocemos que su conocimiento sobre sí mismo es mucho mayor que el que podemos tener los demás. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias a las dos. Espectacular la charla. Y bueno, y hay varias preguntas, y tenemos varias preguntas que ya teníamos armadas, así que digamos que habían llegado, así que voy a arrancar, así podemos aprovechar lo que nos queda. Me gustaría empezar con una pregunta que hay en el chat, que creo que, Verónica, es algo que vos mencionaste, pero que vuelven a consultar, y creo que es gran parte de todo esto, habla de la necesidad que tenemos de construir un lenguaje, ¿no? del que todos sepamos de qué estábamos hablando cuando estamos hablando de eso, y alguien pregunta en el chat si no podrías aclarar de nuevo, o extenderte un poquito en lo que hablaste, en lo que definiste cuando hablaste de qué es género, y por qué te referís entonces a la sexualidad de las infancias trans.
Bien, en realidad me parece que el término apropiado sería identidad de género, ¿no? Pensar en lo que estamos pensando acá todo es cómo se identifican estos alumnos y alumnas. La diferencia principal que tenemos que hacer es que el sexo tiene que ver con los atributos biológicos de la genitalidad de cada persona, mientras que el género tiene que ver con esto, una identidad, es algo más interno, es algo que está más muy claramente ligado a lo social, digamos, ¿no? En términos de sexualidad, quizás sexualidad no es la palabra correcta, sino que sería más esto, identidad de género.
Bien, muchas gracias. Porque me parece que es parte de la construcción, tiene que ver con esto, ¿no? Con que armemos un lenguaje.
Totalmente.
Así que muchas gracias. Bien, y hay varias preguntas en el chat, voy levantando. Hay una que refiere a si hablar de infancias trans no es contradictorio con lo performativo, con la actuación, desde la idea de que hay una fluidez, y que digamos, esta fluidez que tienen niños, niñas, adolescentes, no habría mejor que plantear, por ahí para la escuela, esto meto yo en la pregunta de Carlos, un planteo más fluido, sin armar o sea, géneros más tan estáticos. ¿Ustedes ven esto como una posibilidad a pensar?
Algo más cercano a lo no binario, digamos.
Claro, exactamente.
Sí. Me parece que es un tema que de hecho, bueno, ahora está muy en boga porque ahora salió un nuevo decreto que determina que otra posibilidad en el documento de identidad es la X, que engloba identidades que no se identifican ni como femeninas ni como masculinas. A nivel escolar, creo que sería sumamente, pero no me parece imposible, me parece sumamente difícil, por esto que decíamos, que está todo pensado desde el binarismo, que si ya de por sí cuesta que un alumno que quiere seguir en el binarismo, porque al fin y al cabo las infancias trans no están poniendo en jaque que existan dos géneros, sino que lo que están poniendo en jaque es la asociación del género a lo biológico estrictamente. Si ya eso de base es complejo, un alumno que venga a poner en jaque la mera existencia del binarismo, no digo que no se pueda, me parece muchísimo más complejo. No sé, Mariano, si tenés algún comentario.
Y acá hay un elemento muy importante que bueno, estoy leyendo a mi amigo Carlos Torrendel. Sí, yo iba a hacer un comentario en esa línea. Acá lo que hay es una regulación estatal, nos puede gustar o no es el caso que estamos analizando, hay una regulación estatal donde en algún sentido hay un trinarismo. ¿En qué sentido? En que hay alguien que se puede salir de ese binarismo para volver de otra manera. Y ahí hay muchas preguntas de carácter político, que no viene al caso, de carácter moral, muy fuertes obviamente, que cada uno tendrá su interpretación, pero sí esa regulación es muy importante desde el punto de vista de la distribución de los cuerpos en las instituciones escolares. Es decir, que un chico, una chica vengan con el papel y diga, yo ahora me llamo de esta manera y soy tal cosa, era algo que en general, que la escuela no permitía para cuestiones de mucho menos compromiso personal. Para cosas de mucho menos compromiso personal. Por ejemplo, para cuestiones de carácter religioso, por ejemplo, para cuestiones de carácter político. La escuela tendía a dejar de lado la propia reivindicación de esas identidades. En cambio, acá es el Estado el que permite, es el que regula y de alguna manera permite, y en la medida que el Estado regula y permite, ordena, también no es menor, el Estado ordena esa situación, de alguna manera la avala, y eso tiene enormes consecuencias en la vida cotidiana de escuelas que están formateadas de una manera completamente diferente. Pensemos que todavía hoy en casi todas las escuelas del país los chicos y las chicas hacen filas diferentes. Sí. Nadie entiende muy bien por qué. En el registro de asistencia están primero los varones y después las mujeres. Nadie entiende bien por qué. En la educación física, en algunas provincias no, pero en la mayoría sí, siguen separándose varones y mujeres, y que incluso se entiende que el profesor de los varones es un varón y la profesora de las mujeres es una mujer. Sí. Eso
una cosa con respecto a un comentario pequeño con respecto a lo de la educación física, es que hay un debate muy grande alrededor de eso. Ahora con los Juegos Olímpicos se volvió a estar en boga porque el Comité Olímpico Internacional tuvo que decidir cómo determinar quién podía participar en qué categoría, porque bueno, en cuestiones de alto rendimiento, el choque constante es entre el derecho a que se respete la identidad propia y la competencia justa. Hay cuestiones en el alto rendimiento, hay cuestiones biológicas que sí entran ahí en conflicto. Pero en la escuela, que en general los chicos juegan al hockey, juegan al básquet, juegan al fútbol, son deportes que muy fácilmente pueden hacerse mixtos. Y sin embargo, como bien decía Mariano, en líneas generales siguen estando separados.
Bien, no sé si querías terminar lo que estabas diciando, Mariano.
No,
si
no.
te quedaba algo. Ok, bien, entonces...
brillantemente.
Hermoso, bien. Entonces paso a algo que mencionaron hoy al pasar, pero que está por ahí un poco, que lo mencionan también en su trabajo, que habla, que vos mencionabas, Verónica, acerca de esta idea de, bueno, la escuela es un espacio hegemónico, ¿no? Es heteronórmico, es cisnorma, y eso hace que si vos tenés un estudiante o una estudiante que está cómoda dentro de ese espacio, bueno, nada, se mantiene, encuentra sus espacios para poder reconocerse, para pensarse, etcétera, etcétera. Y hay algo que menciona en el trabajo que a mí me gustaría que pudieran desarrollar un poquito más, que es la idea de quienes no están ahí, quienes están en el conflicto, tienen una suerte de invisibilidad, ¿no? Como que falta esa cosa de dónde o quién soy yo, y le saca esto que para mí es lo más interesante, que es la posibilidad, ¿no? La posibilidad de nombrarse, la posibilidad de ser. Si quisieran comentar un poquito más acerca de esta idea de la invisibilidad dentro de la escuela.
Para mí eso tiene mucho que ver con la representación, digo, con que no hace falta que una escuela diga que algo está mal para excluirlo, invisibilizarlo, digo, en cierto punto no nombrarlo de ninguna manera es incluso peor, porque es como vos decís, no se piensa en la posibilidad. De hecho, hay otro concepto que es muy interesante, que es el concepto del currículum nulo, que es esto que no se menciona, que enseñamos con lo que no mencionamos. Entonces, si solo mencionamos la heterosexualidad, si en las clases de literatura solo leemos historias de amor heterosexuales, si en las clases de cualquier otra materia lo pensamos así, si todas las narrativas que tenemos de nuestros docentes, si se nos separa y es como, ay, vos gustás de Juancito y vos gustás de Juancita, si se juega siempre eso, que es algo que se hace constantemente, al no mencionar que puede haber una posibilidad de que Juancita guste de otra Juancita, entonces ahí ya hay algo que está siendo excluido y que no se está dando la posibilidad al alumno de que hable de esto. Por eso me parece que esto de la representación es tan importante. Y que falta en la escuela, en un punto muy básico del currículum en general, y después falta también en un lugar muy esencial, con esto de por qué dividimos así, por qué pensamos que son distintos y que se tienen que gustar, digamos, ¿no?
Sí, déjame volver a tu pregunta. Me hizo acordar el trabajo que hicimos con Pablo Narodowski hace muchos años, Pablo de la Universidad Nacional de Quilmes, sobre masculinidades en las escuelas, y bueno, Pablo siguió trabajando mucho sobre eso. El punto es que no se trata solo de la cuestión de género, sino que la exclusión o la invisibilización tiene una densidad mayor que a veces también, o casi siempre, también intersecta con las cuestiones de género. Para los varones, por ejemplo, ser maricón o ser tratado como un maricón, no porque sea homosexual, ¿no? Sino estamos hablando del maricón, que no es necesariamente una acusación de homosexualidad, sino de debilidad, de afeminamiento porque sos sensible, o los gordos, las gordas. Bueno, todas esas cuestiones no están puestas sobre la mesa y generan no solamente mucho sufrimiento en las personas que tramitan esas situaciones, sino también generan un tipo de formación vinculada a esos estereotipos. Voy a dar un ejemplo que probablemente a muchos colegas no les guste, pero lo que en términos Foucaultianos llamamos la compulsión a la confesión, que en términos pedagógicos decimos participame, tenés que participar. Entonces, de vuelta, los que son más tímidos o los que son más reflexivos y reflexivas, quiero decir, o los que creen que su opinión no es tan importante como la profesora cree o el profesor, bueno, ahí también hay formas de exclusión. Entonces, a veces son muy sutiles, a veces no son tan dramáticas, algunas como otras que realmente provocan un sufrimiento enorme, pero en esta eclosión de la infancia de la modernidad es que empiezan a aparecer todos estos fragmentos más o menos dispersos, y es donde se produce la gran pregunta: ¿hasta dónde es posible sostener este andamiaje asimétrico y hasta dónde algo de esto está cambiando o definitivamente va a cambiar?
Claro, este tema de romper con la idea de obediencia, ¿no? Como que hay como niveles diferentes que ustedes mencionan en el trabajo. Acá preguntan en el chat si se gestiona de manera diferente en escuelas públicas y privadas, y cómo se hace entonces una pedagogía de los derechos humanos de las personas trans desde la escuela moderna.
Nosotros encontramos, y nos sorprendió por nuestros prejuicios, muchas escuelas católicas antes, con una predisposición muy interesante a estos temas. no creo que podamos avanzar mucho más en la respuesta, más que con un contraejemplo de lo que nos parecía nuestro prejuicio. Me parece que son temas que desde el punto de vista de lo explícito cada vez se repudian, se rechazan menos. O sea, es muy difícil que alguien rechace públicamente a un chico trans o lo repudie públicamente. Sí se encuentran modalidades implícitas de exclusión o bueno, de distintas estrategias para minimizar la situación. Pero en todo caso hay un reconocimiento. Y creo que en gran medida eso tiene que ver con la ley, porque el sistema educativo en la Argentina es muy jerárquico. Entonces, si una ley dice que hay que hacerlo, y como decimos los docentes, si te dicen de arriba, te dicen de arriba, y hay que hacerlo. Y el temor al sumario, y el temor a la queja de los padres.
Sí, que una de las cosas que habíamos conversado es que la ley lo que hace un poco es revertir lo que sucede habitualmente, lo que venía sucediendo históricamente, que el temor quizás estaba ubicado en estas identidades generalmente excluidas. Digo, el temor era de justamente un niño trans en hablar, o cualquier persona del colectivo LGBT. Y ahora el temor está más puesto del lado de las escuelas, de que si no tratan con esa situación correctamente, ellas van a ser las que van a ser repudiadas después públicamente.
Ok. O sea, sí que ustedes dirían que tiene más que ver, o sea, y acá meto una pregunta yo, ¿tiene que ver con un cambio entonces real de la escuela? Digo, porque la ley tiene un montón de años, casi 10, y sin embargo uno ve una cierta fricción y una cosa, como todavía ustedes bien dicen, disruptiva. ¿Es el miedo a que me maten el social media, en Twitter, ¿no? Que salga, que explote, o ven un cambio genuino real y que tal vez lo que nos falta es capacitación, educación al respecto para poder llevarlo adelante? Digo, no por decir que no lo están haciendo porque no quieren solamente, sino porque tal vez
Cambio real, nosotros vemos que ocurre porque la realidad cambia. Ahora, si eso es genuino en el sentido de que está libre de cualquier compulsión y es un efecto del libre albedrío, no te lo podría decir en casi ninguna conducta humana, y mucho menos en esta. Y mucho menos en esta. Lo que señala Verónica es importante. Hay una ley que ordena, y eso es un factor central. Por supuesto que en las entrevistas con los docentes y con los directivos hay matices de todo tipo, y de hecho hay situaciones que Vero encontró en el trabajo de campo, en donde fue una maestra la que finalmente terminó de alguna manera evidenciando la situación que pasaba con uno de sus alumnos trans. Entonces, por eso digo, hay una heterogeneidad fenomenal, pero mi opinión, digamos, más estructuralista es que todo se ordena por la ley estatal.
Sí, y en el trabajo de campo que menciona Mariano, el cambio genuino yo lo noté más en el alumnado que en los directivos. Noté que como una buena predisposición de los directivos de adaptarse, de entender la situación. Directivas muy católicas que me dijeron, yo nunca lo voy a entender, pero si es feliz, ¿qué voy a hacer? ¿Quién soy yo para meterme ahí? Como respuestas realmente muy hermosas, pero después en el alumnado como una respuesta mucho más rápida. Como, ¿cuál es el problema? No sabemos a qué baño ir. Bueno, listo, juntemos plata para hacer una obra, para tirar abajo los baños y hacer un solo baño para todos. Listo. Y se juntaron y juntaron plata. Como sin duda, digamos.
La confesión de una directora de una escuela, sea católica, judía, musulmana o atea de todo ateísmo, que dice, es un problema de él, yo no me meto, o de ella y no me meto, es, digamos, la evidencia de el cambio a una cultura posfigurativa. Porque
sí, totalmente.
50 años atrás, a una cultura prefigurativa, perdón,
prefigurativa, sí.
50 años atrás, los adultos, los docentes, entendían que tenían que involucrarse en eso, que era su obligación involucrarse en eso, y jamás admitirían que alguien, un chico de 8, 9, 10 años, pudiese tener un criterio propio para resolver, no ya su propia vida, sino algo tan significativo vinculado al sexo y al género. Bueno, ahí creo que es un buen ejemplo de esta situación en la que estamos atravesando.
Y la otra cara de esto, que está buenísimo y que celebramos, es que no hay mucha instrucción más que esa. Digo, también lo que me decían las directoras es, bueno, yo me bajé la ley, la leí, hice lo que decía. Le cambié el nombre en el registro, le pregunté a qué clase de educación física quería ir, le pregunté si este baño estaba bien, le dije que se pusiera el uniforme que quisiera, fin. Digo, hay un punto ahí que está bueno, que es, bueno, aceptamos el deseo del menor, escuchamos lo que necesita, pero bueno, claramente hay una falta de algo un poco más claro, de un protocolo un poco más preciso para llevar a cabo en estas situaciones, porque si no es eso, es una vez pasó esto y lo resolví como pude, pero no hay todavía algo sistematizado que acepte que esto va a suceder cada vez más y que es para una parte, que va a pasar a ser una parte cotidiana, me parece, de los alumnados en todas las escuelas.
Absolutamente, absolutamente. Y retomo entonces algo que mencionaste vos, Mariano, que es el rol del docente o de la docente, que preguntaban un poco en el chat también, bueno, ¿cómo hace, qué hace, cuál es el rol docente en todo esto?
No, nosotros cosas útiles no sabemos. No nos dedicamos a cosas útiles. No lo sabemos. O sea, cuál debiera ser el rol del docente, la verdad que no se excede. Hay trabajos, hay literatura sobre eso, y hay publicaciones en la Argentina, incluso de gente que hizo una experiencia. Nosotros no estábamos tan enfocados en ese problema. Me parece que sí, en función del entusiasmo que tenía Vero recién, yo quisiera poner un poco más de escepticismo, en el sentido que a veces en nuestro país hay opiniones que están calladas, que están acalladas, de gente que no está de acuerdo con esto, y no escuchamos sus motivos. Y a mí me gustaría escucharlos, y a mí me gustaría que haya un debate más explícito sobre esto, sin que nadie tenga temor a la cancelación. Digamos, todos los que tenemos una cierta edad, yo tengo 6 décadas, probablemente muchas de estas cosas nos choquen. Una cosa que discutíamos con Verónica y con Delfina es: ¿cómo puede ser que vos tenés un hijo de 8 años que te dice quiero ser varón siendo mujer, o viceversa, y vos no pienses que lo tenés que mandar a un psicólogo, acá que tenemos tantos neurocientistas, para que lo reeduquen, digamos, como hubiese acontecido en otras épocas? ¿De dónde salió nuestra admisión de una soberanía o una autonomía, como quieran llamarlo, tan importante para pensar que un chico de 8 años tiene un conocimiento sobre sí mismo que ningún adulto puede determinar que ese conocimiento es inválido? Y no estoy juzgando si es inválido o no. Lo que estoy poniendo sobre la mesa es que sería interesante, pensando en la pregunta que hizo recién el colega sobre qué hacer los docentes, que haya una discusión más honesta, más genuina, como dijiste vos, y que podamos ir creciendo de a poco en este tema y encontrando los equilibrios que cada uno pueda tramitar. Me parece que ese es un punto muy importante. Por eso al principio yo dije, nosotros no tenemos una posición moral sobre esto. En todo caso la tenemos, pero no viene el caso. Estamos tratando de plantear las aristas de una dimensión súper compleja, y que por otro lado nos abre enormes desafíos respecto del futuro de la escuela. Enormes desafíos porque los cimientos, parte de esos cimientos, son los que están siendo cuestionados. Por eso decía yo en chiste, no es un problema de que te reemplace inteligencia artificial, sino que esas relaciones sociales de la educación establecidas asimétricamente, con todas esas características, son las que hoy están en algún sentido debilitándose.
No sé si querés decir algo vos, Vero, sobre esto. Perdón, me pareció que te interrumpía.
No. Una de las cosas que me acuerdo que conversábamos es, me acuerdo, Mariano, que vos dijiste algo así como: este niño necesita una nota para salir más temprano a almorzar, salir más temprano del colegio, necesita autorización para todo lo que tiene que ver con la regulación de su cuerpo, y ahora existe una ley que sin embargo le da como autonomía total para hacer esta otra cosa, que es como esto, una cuestión muy como básica y esencial de su identidad. Que de nuevo es lo que decía Mariana. Veo algunas preguntas en el chat que tienen que ver con, bueno, pero en vez de pensar en alumnos trans, podemos pensar en el no binario, no estamos reforzando el binarismo. Y nosotros no estamos no estamos juzgando, no estamos haciendo un comentario valorativo sobre la existencia de los niños trans. Los niños trans existen, la transexualidad existe, entonces lo que estamos haciendo es investigando y pensando sobre cómo eso que ya existe y que es una realidad afecta a la escuela de estas maneras como tan esenciales.
Y la pregunta de Carlos Torrendel es muy pertinente, provocativa, pero está bien. Y él hace de un lugar de muy buena fe. Pregunta si un chico se asumiera una identidad nazi, si se lo permitiríamos. Bueno, no se lo permitimos. En la Alemania nazi no solamente que se permitía, sino que se alentaba. En la Argentina no lo permitimos. Ahora, sí, ¿qué quiere decir? Que no cualquier cosa permitimos. Eso está claro, no cualquier cosa permitimos. Ahora, si lo que está por atrás de la pregunta de Carlos es, ¿admitimos cualquier cosa? La respuesta es no. ¿Qué cosas admitimos y qué cosas no? Yo creo que es un punto discutible. Por supuesto que es un tema. En una democracia es algo que tenemos que discutir. Sí, el ejemplo del nazi, el recurso a Hitler siempre es fácil. El problema son los grises. El recurso a Hitler siempre daba resultado. Hay un teorema, ¿no? De que en cualquier discusión siempre vas a terminar yéndote a Hitler, porque claro, es el recurso más fácil.
Sí. En cualquier discusión de arte de Duchamp y en cualquier discusión de historia Hitler. Esa es la regla.
Por eso, pero claro, o sea, pero igual el punto de Charlie a mí me parece que es correcto. Está bien, Hitler no, eso es obvio que no, pero ¿qué sí? ¿Cuáles grises sí? Entre la estructura rígida, tradicional, conservadora, hetero, cis, normativa, etcétera, de la institución escolar de la modernidad, y Hitler, como que hay espacios. Yo creo que el reconocimiento de las infancias trans es un espacio. Ahora, la pregunta es, ¿eso es saludable para los chicos o no es saludable? A mí me parece que es una discusión válida, con independencia de la ley, que estamos en un ámbito académico, ¿no? Me parece que es una discusión que hay que darla honestamente, y bueno,
Sí, es una
más
discusión
vale
que se dará en
darla
otro
antes que
ámbito.
ocultarla, ¿no?
Sí, sí, sí. Y es una discusión que se hará en otro ámbito, en otras áreas de especialidad, me parece.
Bueno, sí,
Excelente.
sí.
Sí, espectacular. Bueno, y para terminar, me robo un pedazo de su trabajo que dice, bueno, si ese chico o esa chica pudo construir su genericidad de acuerdo a su propia percepción, ¿por qué no hacerlo todos? ¿No? Como terminando con una nota, digamos, de optimismo y de posibilidades, y como le dije a Gina, les pregunto a ustedes que tienen un par de minutos para si les quedó algo pendiente o con algo que quisieran cerrar el mensaje para llevarse a casa, el take home message de su charla, les dejo la sala.
Yo voy a seguir brevemente con el optimismo que mostraba antes, y saludo a Delfina, que también está acá en la sala y que escribió este trabajo con nosotros, y que me acuerdo que me dijo, yo creo que es enteramente posible construir una escuela que no sea heterosis. Y me quedé siempre con ese comentario pensando, bueno, ojalá, ojalá, y que sea una escuela que no sea, digo, no para construir una escuela que sea necesariamente trans, homosexual, pero construir una escuela que sea un espacio de descubrimiento de lo propio, de descubrimiento de la identidad, y que no esté tan cruzada por estas identidades que nos legaron históricamente y nos forzaron de alguna manera. Es esto que decías vos, Cecilia, como de entender las posibilidades, que sea un lugar donde se contemple ese panorama de posibilidades.
Bien. ¿Mariano?
No, yo no soy tan optimista. En este sentido, creo que entiendo que muchas veces negar estos problemas tiene que ver con el sufrimiento de la gente, de los chicos, y me parece muy productivo poder ponerlo en cuestión. También me parece que estamos en un clima de época respecto de estos temas. Si me preguntan mi opinión, yo estaría completamente de acuerdo con este clima de época, pero me parece que no tenemos que bajar los brazos de la sospecha de nosotros mismos. Cuando una época está tan encadenada con lo que pensamos, a mí me gusta como intelectual, como profesor, como judío, me gusta sospechar un poquito de nuestras propias convicciones. Pero por eso el trabajo, decíamos, que no tiene un punto moral, sino más de consecuencias en términos estructurales de la pedagogía. Gracias por el aguante, y Charlie, también te aguanto vos. Y una última cosa, Cecilia, yo quiero decir algo
Por favor.
Me encantó y me encanta trabajar con mis alumnos, con dos jóvenes estudiantes como Verónica y Delfina, que me enseñan muchísimo, y uno aprende muchísimo y también se deconstruye, como dicen ellas. Así que para mí fue un placer estar en esta investigación y lo disfruté muchísimo.
Lo mismo para mí.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, muchísimas gracias. La próxima armamos un panel y le invitamos también a Delfina y hablábamos los tres, porque creo que todavía hay bastante tela para cortar al respecto de esto. Les agradezco mucho de nuevo por haber participado. Bueno, y como tenemos los tiempos justos, I'm going to switch back to English. Gracias Mariano, gracias Vero. And I'm going to switch back to English to close this symposium, and I'm truly honored to present our next speaker, Lise Eliot. Hi, Lise. I think that you are somewhere in the room. If you want to turn on your camera and your audio. Oh, hi, Lise.
Hi, Cecilia. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Thank you very much for being here. Again, we were talking with Gina that there is this downside that we couldn't bring you here to Argentina, but we can have you online, so I'm truly happy. Thank you, it's a pleasure. And well, Lise, for the room, I would like to say that Lise is a professor of neuroscience and an executive chair of the Department of Fundamental Science and Humanities at the Chicago Medical School of Rosalind Franklin University of Medicine and Science. She graduated from Harvard. She received her PhD in cellular physiology and biophysics from Columbia University. And she completed her postdoctoral doctoral research fellowship in neuroscience at Baylor College of Medicine, and before turning to public education about brain and gender development. She has published over, more than 50 papers and books and a little bit of everything. And I would like to take the liberty to recommend one thing in particular, if you let me, Lise, which is her book, Pink Brain, Blue Brain, How Small Differences Grow into Troublesome Gaps, which I think is brilliant. So I strongly recommend that book. And today she's with us, and she's going to be talking about how gender grows in the brain. So thank you very much, Lise, again for being here.
Well, it's absolutely my pleasure, Cecilia. I have never been to Argentina, but it's very high on my list. I almost went to Patagonia right before, in late 2018, but I had a family emergency that canceled.
I remember.
I'm really honored to be there virtually, and I want to congratulate you on your first gender symposium in human behavior. I hope you have many, many more, because it's a fascinating and very important topic.
Thank you.
I do have much to tell you, so I'm going to share my screen right away and get started, and look forward to answering your questions as well. So fortunately, Gina Rippon gave me a wonderful, sort of laid the foundation for this, and acquainted you with so much that is important about thinking about brain gender difference. It's a very nuanced topic, and she really said much better than I can the broader context of this and how to think about neuroplasticity when we stick men and women into brain scanners. I'm going to get a little more into the weeds to really try and convince you about what I think of as a lack of real sex difference in the brain, and hopefully spend a little more time thinking about, if there is very little difference between our brains, how do we have these behavioral differences? And we really need to think of this as very much of a developmental process that begins just incredibly early, the differentiation of behavioral gender difference. So let's see. Just for fun, I want to start out with kind of the common perception about brain sex difference, because as Gina mentioned, this is just inescapable. It's kind of the dogma in the media about male brains and female brains, but it was told in such a memorable fashion. If any of you have seen the 2004 film, The Anchorman, with Will Ferrell and Christina Applegate, I have a little clip from that. For those of you who haven't seen it, Will Ferrell is this very successful kind of ignorant, blowhard TV news anchor who doesn't know what he's talking about, but projects great confidence. And Christina Applegate is an upstart journalist and having some success, for which he, of course, has to promptly put her in her place and does something pretty nasty to her, which she responds by saying, "What kind of man are you?" And this is Will Ferrell's famous response.
"I'm a man who discovered the wheel and built the Eiffel Tower out of metal and brawn. That's what kind of man I am. You're just a woman with a small brain, with a brain a third the size
I was trying to.
of us. It's science."
Sorry, I hope you could hear that. I was trying to adjust the volume in the middle. I killed my punchline. I'm going to play it again with my sound a little louder. There we go.
"I'm a man who discovered the wheel and built the Eiffel Tower out of metal and brawn. That's what kind of man I am. You're just a woman with a small brain, with a brain a third the size of us. It's science."
So there you have it. That is the science. That is the dogma. Men have bigger brains, therefore men are smarter. And we've known this since Aristotle. So let's put women in their place. And as I said, this started with Aristotle and the Greeks, as Gina showed you. A more relatively recent example of this is this French sort of early psychologist, Gustave Le Bon, who invented this simple device for measuring people's heads and going from community to community to decide who's more intelligent. So he used his famous cephalometer to measure men and women, and he declared quite confidently that women represent the most inferior forms of human evolution. So there you have it. We've got it all figured out from our brains. Of course, that was 100 years ago, but remarkably enough, this easy approach of just measuring the brain and summarizing somebody's intellectual capacity actually continues today. In some very recent examples that we can see all over the internet is equal opportunity threatened by new findings that male and female brains are different. This is how the science is being perpetually misused. The science on male and female brains helps explain why women don't choose tech careers. Of course, it's somewhere in our limbic system, I guess. And then again, as Gina mentioned, we had the Google memo in I think 2017, 2018, declaring that there's a reason there aren't so many women programmers. It's just we're not hardwired to do it and to like it. But it even extends into the academy, which is perhaps even more troubling to me. So here we have the Catholic University of Valencia, but declaring repeatedly on their website, two sexes, two minds based on scientific evidence. Here's the science. Once again, scientific evidence proves significant differences between the brains of men and women. These significant differences that we've got to take seriously if we're going to really, address diversity. And this is just the underlying dogma that there is two different types of organs, a male brain and a female brain that look differently, that function differently, and that predisposes to different strengths and weaknesses. And again, this is deeply, even into the academy. Here we have a pretty noted psychiatrist, Luann Brizendine from the University of California, San Francisco, publishing these best-selling books. All right, so this is what I hope to address with you in the next half hour or so. And I call them the $1 million questions because unfortunately, there are millions of grant dollars. This came up in the earlier discussion. Why are funding agencies funding this work? What's the rationale? And don't they appreciate the problems inherent in it? And I think we really need to continue to address that because certainly gender health disparities are an important topic, but I don't honestly believe that just further comparing male and female brains in an MRI scanner is going to get us anywhere towards addressing those health disparities. So if there are brain differences, to what degree are they a product of sex or gender, which I'll define for you again, and how, more importantly, and from my perspective, how can brain development, which begins even before birth, but the gendered component of it happens from the moment of birth, how can that inform us about the emergence of these different components of gender, behavior, expression, and identity? So again, I think that Gina primed you for this, but to be clear about our terms, gender is defined as some have called it, Daphne Joel most famously, by the 3 Gs. It's the biological component of maleness or femaleness determined by genitalia, our genes or chromosomes, and our gonads. And these generally match within an individual, but not always. There's certainly many chromosomal and hormonal syndromes in which we don't see a perfect match between those. So it's largely, but not completely binary. Whereas gender is strictly a psychosocial attribute, and it can vary across human cultures, and it describes these familiar attributes that Gina listed, the stereotypes, if you will, that are typical or considered appropriate for male and females in a culture. Importantly, unlike sex, which is largely binary, gendered behavior is not at all binary. And all of these phenomena, behavior, identity, expression, exist on a non-binary spectrum across all of humanity, and that's what's shown here. So most of the psychological sex differences that have been studied ad nauseum are indeed on the small side relative to our sex difference in height. Depending which data set you use, you get a D value of 2.5. I think Gina had a D value of 3. Sex difference in height is pretty darn reliable. There's a certain amount of overlap, but sex differences in behavior, with empathy being one of the more noted ones, are actually pretty darn small, and it'd be very difficult to predict from a particular score whether somebody is male or female. There are a few aspects of behavior that are larger differences. Mental rotation, the spatial skill, physical aggression. These are about a half a standard deviation. So actually not a whole lot different than this, certainly much less than our sex difference in height. Tender-mindedness is a little bit larger. But importantly, and this is really what I talk about in my book, and I meant to say, I don't have a Spanish translation of my book, but there is a Portuguese translation. So it is available out there for any of you who speak Portuguese or French. So importantly, as I discuss, these differences are smaller absent in children and infants. There's virtually no difference in behavior in babies before about a year of age at the earliest. So with all that said, we're bombarded by the fact that there are sociocultural differences between men and women. And unfortunately, many of these work to women's disadvantage. And so the perennial temptation is to explain these important social issues, social problems of gender disparities in health, education, occupations, poverty, unpaid work, to explain those based on brain sex differences. But as I hope to show you, it's a very long gap between those. So do brain sex differences explain these very troublesome gender disparities? So to do that, I need to bring you up to speed with how neuroscientists, how biologists think about sex difference. Of course, this is a topic of great interest to evolutionary biologists. There are 2 sexes in most animals, not all. There's certainly some hermaphroditic animals. My husband studies a sea slug that is both male and female, much more convenient. But the notion of dimorphism, this idea that there's 2 forms as defined by Merriam-Webster, 2 forms within a species, one male, one female, most famously illustrated by the peacock versus the peahen. And this was has presumably evolved through sexual selection, females preferring to mate with males with more colorful tails. But this notion, which is really profound, overt in the biological world, has unfortunately been co-opted by neuroscientists who just love to call anything dimorphic that may be the most subtle level of difference. So studies of brain sexual dimorphism began in non-human species. And here is one of the most dramatic examples of a brain sex difference. We're looking at a species, the zebra finch. It's a species of birds that they mate and pair bond. The male is obviously more colorful, and the male is the one who predominantly does the singing. It's a courtship song that they learn early in life. Well, researchers beginning with Art Arnold looked inside the brains and found that there's an area of the striatum with a nucleus known as RA that is something like 5 to 8 times larger in males than females. Now, this may not look like a lot to you in this kind of grainy micrograph, but this was a dramatic sex difference. And I will tell you right now, there is nothing anywhere close to a 8-fold or 5-fold difference in any structure of the human brain. And this has been looked at, of course, ad nauseum over the last few decades. So nonetheless, this more clear-cut example of dimorphism has been used and co-opted by scientists who want to sound just more sciencey, more scientific, more rigorous, by referring to any kind of male-female difference in behavior, in EEG measures, in heart rate recovery. I mean, many of these things have nothing to do with structure, which is, dimorphism, 2 shapes. The term should be applied to structure, but it's being used across the board to many behavioral and genetic measures because it just adds so much more authority to the project of studying male-female differences. So that's why we titled our paper, Dump the Dimorphism. There's really nothing, when you analyze now decades and decades of brain imaging studies in men and women that fits this term dimorphism, nothing that shows 2 shapes. The differences are extremely subtle, as we'll show you, and unfortunately, or fortunately, not at all reliable. So this is a very long paper. It's something like, I don't know, 30 pages long, which is a little daunting. So if you would prefer, we've got I tweeted about it in a 25 tweet tutorial that is on Twitter. If you happen to be, that's my Twitter handle, and we'll cut to the chase of the paper. So let me just try to get this out of the way. All right. So in science, we have null hypotheses. That's allegedly, when we do experiments, what we're really trying to do is disprove the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis meaning there is no difference. And in the case of brain sex, the null hypothesis is that human brains are sexually dimorphic. My argument is the null hypothesis is winning. The human brain is not sexually dimorphic, nor even meaningfully different between males and females in any of these measures, which is what we go through in our rather lengthy paper. So first, looking at the volumes of specific parts of the brain, such as the amygdala or hippocampus or hypothalamus. Second, looking at the thickness of the cortex. The cortex means bark, and so the very surface of the cortex has said by many people to differ between males and females. Lateralization, that's the degree to which our 2 hemispheres operate independently or asymmetrically. Measures of brain activation using functional MRI have been used exhaustively to look for brain sex difference. And measures of the so-called connectome, connections between different parts of the brain. And then I think it's not showing up here, but also looking at neonatal brain sex differences, which I can tell you right now have by no means been proven definitively. So I'm going to begin very briefly with kind of an overview of what we found in our survey of this 30-some years of structural MRI studies. And this actually is the same paper that Gina pointed to, because it is one of the largest. There's actually a more recent paper out this year with 40,000 participants. But as more and more labs start adding their data to a database, brain imagers can analyze these huge data sets. They don't have to even do an experiment themselves. They just do this bioinformatic approach. And in this case, these English or British researchers looked at a huge population, thousands of men and women, and found no big surprise. We've known this for decades, that men's brains are larger than women's brains. This is total brain volume. It's a d-value of about 1.4. And you see this is true for gray matter, for all white matter. And we also see it across every individual structure, the amygdala, the caudate, et cetera. But obviously, bigger bodies have bigger brains. Men are bigger than women, and they're taller and heavier. And so not a big surprise that their brains are 11% larger than women. Interestingly, the other organs, internal organs of the body, like the heart, like the lungs, like the kidney and liver, are actually more than 10%, some of them approaching 20 or 25% larger in males than females. So the brain is actually more similar, despite our body size, than other structures. But when you really want to look within the brain and compare different structures, you have to correct for individual body size. And that's even true if you're looking only within women or only within men. There's so much range in body size that you can't just compare two individuals to say who's got the bigger hippocampus, which could have significance for depression and all kinds of other things, until you control for body size or head size. And so when they did this in this study, interestingly, the figure I'm showing you here was the one published in the main paper. You had to dig into the supplemental kind of hidden data to find the real results, which is when you correct for individual head size, these differences you can see dissolve to almost nothing, a 0.1, 0.2 difference, tremendous overlap between males and females in the size of individual structures. And I've only left the ones that were significant. All the rest of these were no longer statistically significant after this correction. So actually, I had already done a similar study with a bunch of medical students, one looking at dozens, over 30 studies of human hippocampal volume. Hippocampus is this green structure, and a second study looking at the volume of the amygdala, because both are very often stated in the scientific literature, in the popular literature, to differ between men and women. The amygdala is said to be larger in men, hippocampus larger in women. We found no significant differences at all. It's all of less than 1%, 0.6% larger volume in females, which was not significantly different in the amygdala, only 1% difference. Again, not significantly different. And the D values for these, you can see, are quite small. So if we plot these compared to the results of the height difference and the behavior difference, you can see the sex difference in brain volumes is really just enormously small. All right, so. And then this looked across many studies, over 30 studies, 33 studies, beginning with some smaller, older studies, but ones that are still widely cited as claiming, for example, the caudate nucleus is bigger. I hope you can take home from this, and that among all these structures, papers are finding differences. Some papers find structures larger in males and may make a big deal about it. Some finding the same structures larger in females, but when you look across all these studies, there's a lack of reliability. So in other words, many of these findings are likely just noise or false positives. Similarly, if we look at the cortex, those were all subcortical structures. If we look on the surface of the brain, the raw volumes, all larger in males. Once we correct for total head size or total brain size, you know, the fact that individuals come in different body sizes, you see there's almost no difference between males and females. And similarly, cortical thickness. And this is a topic that's come under a lot of interest, claims that women have a thicker cerebral cortex, as shown in these pink studies, are counterbalanced by many studies that find no difference. some that actually find thicker cortex in males. And importantly, compared to studies done at the microscopic level, where pathologists actually dissect the brain and measure under a microscope, which is far more rigorous, far more accurate than MRI, no differences have ever been detected in the thickness of the cerebral cortex. So again, this is just kind of a rumor that is not substantiated when you assimilate all the data. This notion of left-right differences, also very widely propagated in the literature. The notion that that men are more lateralized than women, that they tend to use both hemispheres independently or one at a time, whereas women were said to be better connected. I'm doing this because this is supposed to be the corpus callosum that's connecting our two hemispheres. And we use the two hemispheres in synchrony. And that's shown by, there's some studies that have found this. This is one rather small study that found in a language task that women showed greater symmetry between left and right hemisphere than the men in the group who were somewhat more left dominant. So that was one study, but a meta-analysis of this that I'm not showing you here debunked that across several dozen studies. There's no difference in language lateralization. Most of us use our left hemispheres more for language, nor is there any difference in the structures that interconnect left and right hemisphere. So the corpus callosum is this large white matter band that interconnects left and right. Another smaller structure that interconnects left and right is known as the anterior commissure, shown here in cross section. And across many large studies, there is no reliable difference in the corpus callosum. And yet you will hear this all the time, that women allegedly have a larger corpus callosum than men and a larger anterior cingulate. And frankly, this was really put to rest by a paper just published in 2019, a large review by researchers in Norway and UK who've been studying brain lateralization and looking at sex differences over many, many years. And basically, they find that there's this extremely small difference in activity level between left and right hemispheres, that is between men and women, but that these sex differences in hemispheric asymmetry do not explain any behavioral cognitive differences. And they conclude the paper with this rather strong statement: our hope is the present paper represents the metaphorical final nail in the coffin of the idea that left-right differences between men and women explain anything about our thinking skills. All right, in our study, we also reviewed hundreds of studies of functional MRI. This is where you go in the scanner and you're performing some task, such as that famous spatial skill, the mental rotation task. They put men in the scanner, women in the scanner, doing the task, hoping to find different areas of the brain that are activated. And of course, the occasional paper with a small sample does report a difference. But across, when you synthesize all of these studies together, they're enormously contradictory and not at all reliable. In the case of emotion processing, this has been looked at so extensively that there's now been 7 meta-analyses. And I won't take time to go through this. It is in our paper, but they all find different things. In the green are lack of sex difference. Blue is when males are more active than females. And of course, even meta-analyses integrating dozens of papers find conflicting results for sex difference. So we might understand this a little better based on a paper that came out from Stanford demonstrating publication bias in the fMRI studies. So what they did was they collected 179 functional magnetic resonant imaging studies of brain sex differences. And looking across them, they divided up the studies according to the sample size. And then on the y-axis, we see the number of areas of the brain that were found to differ significantly between men and women. And so the laws of statistics tell us that as sample size gets bigger, your statistical power, your chance of detecting significant group differences should go up. And so you should be able to see, if there are real differences, you should be able to see them better as the sample size grows. But in fact, that result was not found at all. In fact, there were many, many small studies that found difference, and even an excess of studies that found difference relative to the total effect size, such that they were able to conclude that most of the brain sex imaging literature is just littered with false positives, especially for the fMRI studies that tend to be quite small. So there really is not a single area of functional activation that differs reliably between men and women. And so when I say the literature's littered, what it's littered by are what we call false positives. And in science, we have a name for this, the file drawer effect, whereby you run an experiment. If you get a significant difference, hallelujah, we can publish. Editors prefer positive findings, journals prefer positive findings. And the stuff that doesn't find a significant difference, let's say you're studying, let's say you're just interested in language processing, you have no interest in sex difference, but hey, half of our subjects were men, half of our subjects were women. We could get an extra paper if we just do a post hoc analysis. And so lots of groups did that. And if they happen to find a difference, bingo, they publish. If they happen not to find a difference, well, they already published their original study. Let's just move on. And so it's a function of the sexiness of sex differences that the scientific literature is filled with differences, and the similarities remain in people's metaphorical file cabinets. So I'll summarize then real quickly and have a few minutes left to talk about development. I hope I've convinced you, and if not, please do consult our paper, that contrary to neuroscientists' never-ending faith, larger studies are not finally discovering the true or real, there are no real brain sex differences. The differences that have been found are enormously small or quite small and incredibly variable from population to population. So we have not identified any species-wide or humanity-wide sex differences in the brain. They seem to vary from group to group. And that's probably because the amount of brain variation that is due to sex is just smaller than our enormous individual variability. We are, as humans, as we know, are all different. And those otherwise genetic and environmental differences are overriding even sex and gender. So please dispense with this idea that there's such a thing as a male brain or a female brain. And I apologize, I wasn't able to make the whole talk in the last hour, but I don't know the degree to which you studied. There's certainly been many, many dozens of studies now looking at transgender people's brains. And my reading of the literature is that it's equally as equivocal. There is no convincing evidence that there's such a thing as a transgender brain. Human brains are not dimorphic. There aren't two forms of human brains as there are the gonads. We have ovaries or we have testes. Brains aren't like that. Hearts aren't like that. Kidneys aren't like that. Just like all these other organs, the brain is monomorphic. And the best proof of that is the fact that we can transplant these other organs between men and women. Nobody's done a brain transplant yet, but it would be very interesting to see what the gender expression would be in such a situation. Also important, I want to emphasize that a lot of people in the medical field feel that because we have many gender health disparities, things like depression and anxiety, which are more common in women, attention deficit, substance abuse disorder, autism, more common in men. And I'm only focusing on brain disorders. There's a lot of other disorders as well that differ. There's this faith, there's this women's health movement that has pushed this idea that if we would just study sex differences more, we could get to a better understanding of these health differences and better diagnose and treat them. And I argue that, at least in the case of brain disorders, we don't need to do we've done enough research on brain structure to know that there is nothing there that's going to suddenly explain to us why women are more prone to depression. I believe there's a lot of other causes that are not directly explainable by just simple brain structure. So maybe a better way to think about the brain is as intersex, which Daphne Joel kind of coined a while ago, although I know she's not totally comfortable with that idea, or the intersex community may not be totally comfortable with this idea. So I also want to, as I transition to speak for a few minutes about brain and gender development, I want you to appreciate that even if we did find definitive species-wide differences in structure or activation or lateralization between men and women, just because the brain is a biological organ does not mean that these differences are hardwired, meaning pre-programmed by genes and hormones. And so I have a little thought experiment to get you to mull this over. Imagine two individuals in the brain scanner, and they're asked to perform a task. It is a moral reasoning task about a hypothetical scenario and whether the subject acted ethically or unethically. And you see these two subjects are reacting very differently. Subject X has this strong activation of the medial prefrontal cortex. Subject Y, just this little blip in the frontal pole. And of course, I am misleading you to think that subject X is a woman and subject Y is a man. In fact, in this study, these were two individuals of the same gender and the same community, but what they differed in was their religious upbringing. So one was raised as a Christian and one was raised as a non-believer, which I hope you can see now. And from this, I would like you to take away that our gender learning is at least as potent as our other forms of cultural experience in shaping our brains. So that let's then consider how that affects the way we think about brain and gender development. Brain development was the topic of my first book. So and again, I want to thank Gina for previewing this important notion of neuroplasticity. This just shows the brain before birth. There's plenty of plasticity before birth. And the plasticity is really the nurture side. Of course, nature and nurture interact in every aspect of development from the very first cell division. In neuroscience, we use this term plasticity. Plastic is kind of an ugly thing, but you got to admit, we can turn it into any shape object with any type of property. And in the nervous system, we have circuits comprised of individual neurons shown here, one cell with its axon synapsing on another cell dendrite beginning the chain. And it turns out that every corner of these neurons is plastic. And the way they adapt to the environment is through activity. So if a neuron is electrically excited, say because they're playing with trucks or playing with dolls, whichever a neuron in whichever circuit is excited is going to be strengthened. And we use this little phrase, cells that fire together, wire together, to indicate that these cells can be strengthened by activity. Conversely, if you don't play with the trucks or you don't play with the dolls, you will lose the circuits that wire you up for emotional expression or spatial processing. And so there's a very real use it or lose it phenomenon that happens in early brain development. On top of that, we have changes in the genome itself, alterations in the structure of the chromosomes that affect the way genes are expressed that we know are due to environment, things like the degree of nurturing that an animal has permanent epigenetic influence on the nervous system. And the last thing is the myelin, the fatty coating along our axons that speeds information flow. Turns out physical activity, physical practice promotes myelination in motor pathways, and undoubtedly that's true for our cognitive pathways. So every bit of this cellular structure is affected by experience, and there's no time at which that experience is not more potent than in the very first days of life. So this has been proven over and over again. May be familiar to you that the visual system has this very early plasticity. And it's a function of the fact that the number of synapses in the visual part of the brain actually overshoots. The brain goes through an exuberant period. It has extra synapses early in development from which we can prune away the less useful ones and preserve only those that are most useful. And this takes place during what we know as the critical period that peaks at about, I keep covering up my axes. It peaks at about 1 to 2 years of age and then is largely complete by 6 or 8 years of age. So that would be the end of the critical period. And if you have a child with a visual deficit, you want to treat that problem as early as possible because, for example, crossed eyes can lead to a permanent loss of acuity in that eye if we don't solve the problem during the critical period. So the brain is uniquely open to experience, and so that's why we read to our babies and talk to our babies and nurture our babies, and why language itself is so heavily influenced by early experience. So while the visual cortex prunes quite rapidly, the frontal lobe has a bit longer time course, and that is, of course, important for our language skills. All of this left hemisphere region here, including frontal structures, are most open to language development until puberty, with the peak of the critical period happening by age 4. So you best immersed in a language by 4 to 7 years of age. It's easiest to learn it. And then at later ages, as we all know, it becomes much more difficult, which is why I'm not giving this lecture in Spanish. My apologies. So what about gender? Is there a critical period for gender development? And we pretty much believe there has to be, because it does become locked in, and most of us have this perception of our gender as being very deeply internal, a core feature of who we are. I've been a woman, I've been female as long as I can remember, because I've been conscious since I was 3 years of age, and that's probably when my gender identity began to solidify. So like language, gender identity, or gender, the gender binary is a social construct, just like language. So there's all these aspects in the environment that children are immersed in from the moment of birth that tells them gender has 2 forms, and they learn it well, so that even in the first 6 months, they can discriminate male from female voices and faces. And we give them so many clues with the binary, parents, men and women look differently, we dress differently, we exaggerate our physical differences by dressing differently, by wearing our hair differently, makeup, facial hair, etc. That makes it extremely easy for children to learn the difference between male and female, and they are interacted with differently. We have ample evidence now that parents, other caregivers actually do treat boys and girls differently. And then, of course, once they start separating into their separate play groups, there's a very strong peer reinforcement and efforts to be similar to your in-group and to distinguish yourself from the out-group, which in this case is gender, which very much cultivates these gendered strengths and weaknesses. So to people who say, oh, we gave our daughter trucks and our son dolls, and they still turned out completely different, it's just a silly illusion to think that you could raise children in a gender-free way. There is no genderless society on Earth, and they learn it quite well. It's really the most important division in human groups that they process, just as they're learning the words to describe all this. So we accelerate this in many, many ways. Even before babies are born, we have the gender reveal parties. Pick your team, boy or girl. You can leave the party with a pack of M&Ms, either plain or with peanuts if it's the boy. No nuts if it's the girl, etc. And everything is pink or blue. And yet, I think it's really important to shout out and appreciate the brave children who are fighting this binary, because it's pretty inescapable. And yet, more and more societies, thank goodness, are becoming accepting of the fact that that this gender division is artificial, and that somebody who may be born XY may fully identify as female, as this child did, whose name is escaping me, but she was on the cover of National Geographic. And of course, hopefully, everybody knows transgender individuals, whether children or adults, and appreciates that this identity is as deeply real and internal and important to them as a cisgender person.
Sorry, Lise, sorry
yes.
to interrupt you, but you have, if you can wrap up in 5 minutes.
Yes, I will. I will jump
Thank
ahead
you.
in just
Thank
a
you.
moment. So this is a really difficult problem, and I don't claim to have fully figured it out. In fact, I will defer to a colleague at Brown University, Ann Fausto Sterling, who I think has thought the deepest about how we get this understanding of gender and sexuality, given that this binary biology is by no means deterministic, as we know, as given the gender expression across society. It's in the body somehow. My perception of myself as female, obviously something about my brain structure and circuitry is given me this perception throughout my life, but how did it get there? And so she considers in ways very similar to how language develops, and we transition from a concrete sensory experience to symbolic understanding, and that in turn becomes our internalized identity. Ultimately, they get into the body of the brain, but they don't necessarily start out there. It's not pre-wired, it's not hardwired. It's a softly assembled dynamic process, just like everything else that we do with our brain, whether it's a motor skill or a language or cognitive skill. And in the case of gender, it starts early in infancy and is maintained through these interactions with individuals who culturally reinforce sex and gender pretty much at every turn. So what this means is that, no, we're not hardwired to like pink or blue, but children figure it out very quickly based on environmental cues. By the time they're 2 or 3, they've got this figured out, and girls develop a preference and boys actually an aversion. And we give them endless cues. Everything in our environment is talking about a difference between boys and girls. Boys are brilliant, girls are expected to be beautiful. This is where we get to some of the bias. Boys get big, powerful microscopes and telescopes. Girls get the cheap, crappy, lower power ones. To the parents who say, "Oh, I'm not biased. I treat my son and daughter exactly the same." We have big data. And Seth Stevens-Davidovitz published this a few years ago, showing that if you look at anonymized Google searches and parents looking up what their child is, what they're asking about a son or daughter, what you'll find is that parents are more than twice as likely to ask about their son's intelligence and their daughter's appearance, and particularly their weight. So even today, even in the 2020, we have parents from the get-go with very different biases about their sons and daughters. We know this happens in the classroom, that even children between 5 and 6 years of age already learn that brilliance is more of a male trait than a female trait, or they expect males to be more intelligent. We know as early as age 7, that boys and girls already expect girls to be better readers and boys to be better at math, even though at that age, girls are better at reading and equal to boys at math. We know teachers are biased. And this was a great study done out of Israel, showing that the exams that they put together in the classroom tended to show a male advantage in math, whereas the nationally standardized exams did not. And so you could compute this bias score per teacher. And we know that even scientists who should know better are biased to select a male versus a female lab tech with exactly the same credentials. Children understand the difference in job status as early as this was at age 11. Give them 2 made-up jobs. this clipster, we don't know what he's doing, he's soldering something. If it's shown to be a man depicting the job, the students think it's a higher status job and it pays more, even though they show a woman doing exactly the same thing. And it even impairs as young as age 8 that boys negotiate more effectively than girls, even at this young age. So I will wrap up with my conclusion with some images from a wonderful report about women in science. Sex and gender differences in behavior absolutely exist, but generally speaking, they're much smaller than the range of that behavior, whatever it is, math, empathy, within gender. And they are not present at early infancy. There are no clear-cut behavioral differences at early infancy. Sex differences in the brain are tiny, non-binary, and quite variable across populations. There are no differences that explain any of the behavioral differences, no matter what you may read. And what matters is development. Gender, interests and abilities, expression and interest, and identity are largely learned and become ingrained through embodied habit, social interaction, and cultural expectation. So thanks for letting me go over and putting up with my obscured slides, and I'll stop sharing so that I can better see you and answer questions.
Thank you very much. It was an amazing presentation. I think it's full of data, and I think the audience is already asking for the information and for the paper. So I think that I will be asking you for some of the links for your papers and your work, because I think it's amazing, and we need those studies to think about gender from a different perspective, at least. So thank you. We have a few minutes for a couple of questions. And I would like to take something that you talk about, but to go a little bit further. You show all these forms of separation that we learn about gender. It's not something innate, but we learn about those differences. And those differences, obviously, they build up, right? You pick up and they become something that can have like a real impact. And you mentioned in your book, and I'm quoting, that they led to some of the more alarming statistics that shape the way that we think about our children in terms of school performance, mental health, being more or less prone to be victims of a violent crime. So they have real consequence, right? Those differences that seem so naive, like being pink or blue, they become something quite crucial in society. So can you refer a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that if you just look ahead to, if you're teaching your daughter that the most important thing is how pretty she is, and your son, the most important thing is how brave he is, it's going to have consequences for how confident they are in society, and probably how they interact with other people. My husband always teases me, oh, you just want everything to be androgynous and there to be no color in anybody. But on the contrary, I think that we have so constrained boys in so much of their emotional expression and physical expressiveness. I mean, if you take a 3-year-old boy and you let him dress up in anything he wants, he's going to go for the bright and the sparkly and the colorful, unless, of course, he's already been, indoctrinated by dad and brothers. But generally speaking, young children lean towards this more expressive style, and we suppress that in boys. And conversely, girls at that age are fearless, many of them climbing and exploring and getting into stuff, but they just learn, they're just a little bit more enforced, a little bit more constrained, and learn to suppress that exploration, which isn't necessarily so beneficial when you get out, get out into the world and you need to be assertive and you need to advocate for things. So I just feel like I know parents are always looking ahead with their kids, but I think to do it a little bit more, and I do think many young parents are doing this better now with the consequences of the gendered behaviors in mind. You know, that said, that's not going to solve sexual violence. That's not going to solve some of these deep problems. That is strictly a matter of our societal sexism and the tolerance that we have for objectifying women and the tolerance we have for male violence. And, you know, that's all remediable through laws and culture. If you just look across cultures, some cultures are very violent, other cultures much less violent. We know through history that these things are modifiable. We just have chosen not to modify them. We haven't, the wrong people are still comfortable with sexual violence, which is why it's still as prevalent as it is.
Yeah. I'm going to take one of the questions from the chat, and I think that they are referring to this idea of bringing non-traditional play into the house, into the school, right? And I think that there is some kind of fear. I don't know if fear is the word, but like an aversion or a uncertainty of whether that will have any kind of consequence. So if I am not choosing the pink am I doing something for or pushing for a non-conformist kind of way of understanding gender? So what do you think about this non-traditional play?
I mean,
and the effect on behavior, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear it has benefits. I mean, if you play with spatial toys, especially at a young age, you will have a better three-dimensional perception. We know that, you know, building with Legos, that taking a two-dimensional instruction and then taking the blocks and putting it together into a three-dimensional, that is building those spatial circuits that will make you better as an engineer or an architect or even a fashion designer. One of my favorite findings is that fashion designers are as good at mental rotation as, you know, engineers are, and yet, you know, this is just a small group of women, so they don't seem to count as as having good spatial skills. Of course, there's a lot of male fashion designers too, but in schools, in fashion schools, there's actually a lot more women. So you know, if what you're saying is that when you try to encourage gender atypical play or gender neutral play, the children aren't selecting those things, that can be very frustrating for parents and teachers. And so I think to the degree possible, the solution is to just avoid the gendered toys and stick to neutral choices, and then they don't have to make this decision between one or the other. And the other thing, I guess, is that plenty of girls do go through their pink and frilly phase. The Barbie, they only want to wear pink and they only want to wear dresses and they love their Barbies. But interestingly, a lot of girls outgrow that when they're 6 or as early as 6 and 7 years of age, and they kind of go in the opposite direction. It's this tomboy phase that many girls go through. And you know why? It's because they appreciate the power of masculinity. And they realize that if they can do these more so-called boy things, they will have more agency, more power, you know, more status. And so all that pink stuff isn't as interesting to them anymore. So kids aren't stupid. But I think that it's all about opportunity and taking the labels off of things.
Nice. Well, thank you very much. I will give you like a couple of minutes if you want to like sum up or say something to close your presentation that you felt that you wanted to say and you didn't have the time. Yeah, I'm just thrilled that so many of you are interested in this. And I think I just need to end with a big note of hope because, you know, my kids are grown. My oldest is 27 now. My kids are all in their 20s. And so things have changed a lot. I see young parents are much more open-minded about gender. At least I should say, you know, parents in many communities. And certainly there's still plenty of very, very traditional communities where this isn't the case. But inch by inch, more parents are questioning the limitations that gender
poses. And they've been doing this for girls for a long time. Since my generation, we raised our girls to have more assertiveness, and lo and behold, you know, more girls are women graduating from college and getting higher degrees. But we haven't given boys that latitude. And I think more and more parents of boys are less fearful of them, you know, engaging in non-masculine play. So that's really the biggest hurdle. As long as masculinity holds higher power than femininity, it's going to be difficult to convince parents and boys themselves to explore their creative sides. But I feel like inch by inch, generation by generation, we're getting there. So I look forward to seeing your children and how much more diverse they are.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Lise. Thank you for the final positive and wishful thinking kind of close for the event. Thank you very much. I'm going to switch back to Spanish to close the event. Así que bueno, vuelvo a español. Así que fui, vine. Para decirles que, bueno, que todo concluye al fin, hemos llegado al final de este primer simposio de género y comportamiento humano. Como notarán, hay algo de ganas de que esto siga creciendo, por eso le pusimos primer simposio, que esperamos poder continuarlo. Quiero agradecerles de nuevo, muchas gracias a Gina, a Mariano, a Verónica y a Lise por las presentaciones espectaculares que hicieron, por haberse tomado el tiempo de haberlas preparado y por habernos presentado tanta data, y por todas las conclusiones y por las discusiones que dejaron planteadas para que sigamos pensando. Creo que realmente es el comienzo de algo muy bueno para todos, para todas, para todes, y para el área de educación de la Universidad Torcuato Di Tella. Quiero volver a agradecer a la International Brain Research Organization por haberme otorgado el libro Diversity Grant, sin el cual esto no hubiese sido posible, y al CEPE Di Tella por ayudarnos en la aplicación. Y quiero hacer de nuevo y mencionar especialmente a Ornella Iácono, a Soledad Aguilera, a Ileana Minutela, a Julieta Goldstein, a Sergio Hernández y a Julián Arosame, porque la verdad es que sin todo el trabajo que pusieron ellos y ellas tampoco esto hubiese sido posible. Claramente yo sola no hubiese podido. Así que bueno, y por último, obviamente, gracias a todos, a todas y a todos ustedes por haberse sumado hoy y por haber mostrado interés. Espero verlos la próxima y verlas la próxima, y les invito a que pasen a nuestra página web del área de educación de la Universidad Torcuato Di Tella. Ahí va a estar el link de YouTube de la charla de hoy, o sea, del simposio de hoy, y también va a estar toda la info que podamos poner sobre los trabajos y los libros y los papers que fueron mencionados por los distintos panelistas y las distintas panelistas, y bueno, y aparte para que se enteren de cómo sigue esto y de nuestros futuros eventos. Así que bueno, muchísimas gracias, y cierro con un hasta luego.